They call him the Iron-Bound King, the alpha who crushed rebellions with his bare hands and built an empire on the bones of his enemies. But here's the truth nobody tells you about power. It doesn't give a damn about your bloodline or your throne when the knives come from inside your own house. Tonight, King Alaric Voss is about to learn that the most dangerous predator isn't the one you face on the battlefield. It's the one you invited to your table. Stick with me until the end of this story. You're going to want to see how a king falls and what it takes to rise again. And hey, drop a like and comment your city below. I want to know where my tribe is watching from. Us. The throne room stank of old blood and older lies. Alaric Voss stood at the head of the obsidian table, his fingers pressed against the cold stone surface hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Around him sat 12 men who called themselves loyal, 12 heads of the great houses, 12 wolves dressed in silk and ceremony. He could smell their fear underneath the perfume and wine. Good. Outside the palace walls, the capital city sprawled beneath a sky choked with smoke from the forges. 300,000 souls breathing, bleeding, breeding under his rule. The kingdom of Drakkar, his kingdom. Built by his grandfather's sword and his father's ruthlessness and his own brutal efficiency. 42 years old and he'd never lost a battle, never bent a knee, never shown mercy when strength would serve better. The scar running from his left temple to his jaw caught the torchlight as he moved, a gift from the Northern Uprising 7 years back. The man who'd given it to him had died screaming, and Alaric had made sure every rebel in that campaign heard those screams echoing through their camps at night. That's how you build a kingdom. Not with pretty words or gentle hands. Lord Casimir of House Greythorn cleared his throat, a wet, nervous sound that made Alaric's eyes snap to him like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. The man was 60 if he was a day, soft around the middle, rings on every finger. His house controlled the eastern trade routes, made him rich, made him think he was important. Alaric let the silence stretch until Casimir started sweating. You want to know the first thing they teach you when you're born, Alpha? It's not about being the strongest. Any idiot can swing a sword. It's about understanding that every conversation is a battle, every silence is a weapon, and the moment you stop treating people like potential threats is the moment you die. Casimir's voice came out strangled. Your Majesty, if I may address the matter of the grain shipments from— No! The word hit the room like a hammer on an anvil. Alaric straightened, rolling his shoulders. 6'4" of muscle and scar tissue wrapped in black leather and steel. His hair, dark as a raven's wing with threads of silver at the temples, was pulled back tight. No crown today. Didn't need one. Everyone in this room knew exactly who held the power. He moved along the table, boots heavy on stone. The sound echoed, deliberate. Each step a reminder that he could close the distance to any of them in seconds. We're not here to talk about grain, he said. His voice was gravel and whiskey, roughened by years of shouting commands over the clash of steel. We're here because 3 of my generals are dead, not in battle, not with honor. In their beds, poisoned like dogs. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Lord Varick of House Blackwater, younger than Casimir but twice as dangerous, leaned back in his chair. His house controlled the southern armies, 5,000 trained soldiers who answered to his name before they answered to the crown. Tragic, Varick said, and his voice was smooth as oiled leather. But surely your Majesty doesn't suspect anyone at this table of such treachery. Alaric stopped behind Varick's chair, close enough that the man would feel his breath on his neck. I suspect everyone, Alaric said quietly. That's why I'm still alive. He could see the pulse jumping in Varick's throat. Good. Let him sweat too. The thing about being alpha, the real thing, not the title they stick on you at birth, is that you live every single day knowing someone wants what you have, your throne, your power, your life. And the moment you forget that, the moment you trust, that's when they put the knife in your back. His father had taught him that lesson when Alaric was 12 years old, made him watch as they executed his uncle for conspiracy, made him stand there while his own blood choked on the rope, made him understand that family means nothing when power is on the table. Your Majesty. A new voice. Female. Controlled. Alaric turned. Lady Seraphine Drax sat 4 seats down from the head of the table, and she hadn't moved once during the entire exchange. While the others fidgeted and sweated, she remained perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, posture impeccable, eyes the color of winter ice watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She'd arrived at court 6 weeks ago. House Drax was minor nobility, barely worth noticing. They held some land up north, managed a few mining operations, paid their taxes on time. Seraphine's father had died 3 months back, hunting accident, they said, and she'd come to the capital to secure her house's position. Standard procedure. Happened all the time. Except nothing about Seraphine Drax was standard. She dressed simply compared to the other nobles. Dark green today, high-necked, no jewelry except a silver pin at her throat. Her hair was black as coal, pulled back in a severe braid. 28 years old according to the records, but her eyes looked older. Much older. Alaric had noticed her immediately, the way you notice a hawk in a flock of pigeons. "Speak," he said. Seraphine rose smoothly. No hurry, no hesitation. She moved like someone who'd never been afraid of anything in her life, and that alone made Alaric's instincts scream danger. "With respect," she said, her voice clear and precise, "perhaps the question isn't who benefits from the general's deaths, but what those deaths enable." The room went quiet. Alaric's eyes narrowed. "Explain." General Thorne commanded the northeastern garrison. General Varric held the western border. General Corvin controlled the capital's elite guard. She ticked them off on her fingers like she was reading from a ledger. 3 men, 3 critical positions, 3 simultaneous deaths that appear unconnected but create a very specific pattern of vulnerability. "And what pattern is that?" Lord Casimir asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Enlighten us, my dear." Seraphine didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Alaric. "Someone is clearing the board, Your Majesty, removing pieces that would interfere with a larger move. The question you should be asking isn't who killed them. It's what happens now that they're gone." Smart. Too damn smart. Alaric felt something cold settle in his gut. The same feeling he got before battles, when he could sense the enemy positioning in the darkness but couldn't yet see them. "And what do you think happens?" he asked. Seraphine tilted her head slightly. "If I were planning a coup, I'd strike within the next 72 hours, while the replacements are still settling in, while the command structure is chaos, while everyone is looking for the assassin instead of watching the gates." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Varric laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "How wonderfully dramatic, Lady Drax. Perhaps you've been reading too many adventure tales." "Perhaps Lord Varric hasn't been reading enough intelligence reports," Seraphine replied without missing a beat. "The shipment manifests from his southern territories, for instance. The ones showing increased weapons production that doesn't match any crown contract." Varric's face went white, then red. "How dare you!" "Enough!" Alaric's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade through flesh. He moved back to the head of the table, his mind racing. Seraphine's words had the ring of truth to them, but that didn't mean he trusted her. If anything, her insight made her more dangerous. "You didn't survive this long by accepting help from strangers with suspiciously good information." "This council is dismissed," he said flatly. "Lord Varric, you'll provide those manifests to my steward by nightfall. Everyone else, double your house guards and report any unusual movement in the city. We find who did this, and we make an example that'll be remembered for generations." They filed out quickly, eager to escape the tension. All except Seraphine, who moved toward the door at her own measured pace. "Lady Drax." She stopped, turned back. "Yes, Your Majesty?" "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. They moved through the palace corridors in silence, their footsteps echoing off stone walls hung with tapestries depicting the kingdom's bloody history. Every 10 feet, a guard in black and silver plate armor stood at attention. Alaric's personal regiment, men he'd fought beside, bled with, trusted as much as he trusted anyone. Which was to say, not entirely. The palace was a fortress, built on the bones of the old capital after his grandfather had burned it to the ground during the Unification Wars. 5 stories of granite and iron, designed to withstand siege. Every entrance could be sealed within minutes. Every corridor had murder holes in the ceiling. Every room had at least 2 exits. Alaric had memorized every secret passage, every hidden door, every escape route before he turned 16. Paranoid? Maybe. But paranoid men don't get poisoned in their sleep. They emerged onto one of the outer battlements. The city sprawled below them, a maze of stone and wood and desperate humanity. Fires burned in the forge district to the east. The market quarter to the south bustled with evening commerce. The slums to the north, well, those were always chaos. Alaric moved to the edge, looking out over his kingdom. "You know what the hardest part of being king is?" he asked, without looking at her. Seraphine joined him at the wall, keeping a careful distance. "I imagine there are many difficult aspects, Your Majesty. It's not the battles, not the politics, not even the constant threat of assassination." He turned to face her directly. "It's knowing that everyone who smiles at you wants something. Every word is calculated. Every gesture has an agenda. You spend your whole life surrounded by people and die completely alone." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and cooking meat and human waste, the smell of a living city. "Why are you telling me this?" Seraphine asked. "Because I want to know what you want," he said bluntly. "You show up out of nowhere. Minor house, no real power. Then suddenly you're the smartest person in my council chamber, seeing patterns nobody else sees, knowing things you shouldn't know. So tell me, Lady Drax, what's your play?" For the first time since he'd met her, something changed in Seraphine's expression. Not fear, not anger, something almost like respect. "I want the kingdom to survive," she said quietly. "That's all. Bullshit." She didn't flinch at his language. Perhaps. But it's the truth that serves us both right now. Alaric studied her face, the sharp cheekbones, the steady eyes that didn't look away even when most men couldn't hold his gaze for more than a few seconds. The absolute control in every muscle, every breath. "You're either the most dangerous person I've ever met," he said slowly, "or you're about to save my life. I haven't decided which yet." Seraphine smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of her lips, but it transformed her face from severe to something almost beautiful. "Why not both?" she asked. Before he could respond, a bell began to toll from the eastern tower. 3 rings. Pause. 3 more rings. The alarm for enemy movement at the gates. Alaric's hand went to his sword automatically. Beside him, Seraphine had gone perfectly still, her head tilted like she was listening to something beyond the bells. "How many men do you have in the palace right now?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp and urgent. 300 personal guard, Alaric said, already moving toward the stairs. "Another 200 in the barracks." "Why?" "Because if I'm right, you're going to need every single one of them. The coup isn't coming, Your Majesty." She looked at him with those ice-cold eyes. "It's already here." They ran, through corridors suddenly full of armed men, downstairs where servants pressed themselves against walls to let them pass, into the controlled chaos of a fortress going to full alert. Alaric's mind was racing through possibilities, tactics, threats. If someone had infiltrated the palace guard, if the eastern gate was compromised, if the replacements for the dead generals were traitors, Captain Dorian met them in the main hall, his armor half buckled, a cut bleeding on his cheek. He was Alaric's oldest friend, the only man in the kingdom he'd trust with his back in a real fight. "Your Majesty, we've got movement on 3 fronts. Eastern gate's under attack from outside. Someone's opened the northern postern. And there's fighting in the barracks. Our own men are killing each other." Dorian's eyes were wild, but his hands were steady on his weapons. A short sword and a wickedly curved dagger, both dark with fresh blood. "How many are we facing?" Alaric demanded. "Unknown. Could be hundreds, could be thousands. It's coordinated, precise. Someone planned this down to the minute." Seraphine spoke up from beside him. "The barracks first. You need to know which of your men are still loyal. Everything else is distraction until you secure your own forces." Alaric shot her a look. "You got military training I don't know about?" "I read," she said simply. "Extensively." Captain Dorian looked between them, confused and bleeding and waiting for orders. And this was it. The moment. The knife edge where kings either survived or died. Make the wrong call and the kingdom falls. Make the right call, and maybe you live to see dawn. Alaric had made these decisions 1,000 times before, but never with this much chaos, never with this many unknowns, never with a woman he didn't trust telling him things that sounded too right to ignore. "Barracks first," he said. "Dorian, you're with me." "Lady Drax, I'm coming with you," Seraphine interrupted. "The hell you are. She stepped closer, and her voice dropped to something cold and absolutely certain. You need someone watching for patterns while you're watching for threats. You need someone who can see the whole board while you're fighting on it. And right now, Your Majesty, I'm the only person in this palace you can be absolutely certain isn't part of this coup. Why is that? Because if I wanted you dead, you'd already be bleeding. The honesty of it hit him like a fist to the gut. Alaric made a decision that would either save his kingdom or destroy it. Come on, he said, and drew his sword. They moved through the palace like wolves through a burning forest. Alaric led, his blade ready, every sense screaming alert. Dorian covered the rear, methodical and deadly, and Seraphine moved between them, her eyes constantly scanning, tracking, analyzing. The sounds of combat echoed through the halls, steel on steel, men screaming, the meaty thud of bodies hitting stone. They found the first cluster of fighting in the corridor outside the barracks entrance. 6 men in guard uniforms locked in brutal close combat, 3 against 3, and Alaric couldn't tell which side was which. He waded in without hesitation. The first man went down with Alaric's blade through his throat before he even knew the king was there. The second managed to turn, to raise his sword, before Dorian's dagger found his kidney. The third tried to run, and Alaric caught him by the back of his armor, slammed him face first into the wall, hard enough to crack bone. The other 3 guards dropped to their knees immediately, weapons on the ground, hands up. Your Majesty, one gasped. Thank the gods. The barracks? It's a slaughter. Who's attacking? Alaric demanded, his blade at the man's throat. Our own. Some of the newer recruits, the ones who came in after General Corvin died. They've got support from, I don't know, Your Majesty. It's chaos in there. Seraphine crouched beside one of the dead men, examining his armor. This one's markings are wrong, she said quietly. The insignia is flipped. It's subtle, but it's there. Someone's using false uniforms to create confusion. Smart, Alaric growled. Can't tell friend from enemy if they're all wearing the same colors. We need to get to the armory, Seraphine continued, standing. If they control the weapons stores, they control the palace. Everything else is just buying time. She was right. Gods damn her, she was right. Alaric looked at the 3 guards still kneeling. You 3. Get to the throne room. Barricade it. Anyone without the king's personal seal tries to enter, you kill them. Understood? They scrambled to obey, disappearing down a side corridor. The armory was 2 floors down, deep in the palace's fortified core. They descended through increasingly desperate scenes of violence, bodies in hallways, blood on ancient stone, men fighting and dying and not knowing which side they were on. Alaric killed when he had to, which was often. Dorian matched him blow for blow, and Seraphine moved like a ghost, staying close but never in the way, always watching, always thinking. At the armory entrance, they found what was left of the guard contingent making a desperate stand. Maybe 20 men holding the reinforced door against twice that number attacking from the main corridor. Alaric recognized the defending sergeant. Brock. Good man. Scarred face, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a border skirmish 5 years back. Your Majesty. Brock's face flooded with relief. The bastards are trying to... I know what they're trying to do, Alaric cut him off. How long can you hold? Not long. We're out of arrows and down to half strength. Then we make them pay for every inch. Alaric stepped into the front line, and everything narrowed to the familiar rhythm of combat. Strike, parry, riposte. Watch the angles. Protect your flank. Kill before you're killed. This was what he knew, what he was born for. Not the politics or the strategy or the endless chess game of ruling. This, steel and sweat and the simple honesty of violence. A blade came at his head and he ducked, came up inside his attacker's guard, drove his sword through the man's chest, pulled it free, and moved to the next threat before the body hit the ground. Time stopped meaning anything. There was just the next enemy, the next heartbeat, the next breath. And then suddenly it was over. The attacking force broke, melted back into the corridors, left their dead where they fell. Alaric stood in the center of a circle of corpses, breathing hard, his armor drenched in blood. Some of it his, most of it not. Dorian was bent over, hands on his knees, a new cut across his forehead bleeding into his eyes. Brock and his men were still standing, barely, looking like they'd been through a meat grinder. And Seraphine stood against the wall, perfectly composed, not a hair out of place, watching everything with those cold, calculating eyes. "That was too easy," she said. Alaric's head snapped toward her. "Too easy? We just fought off—" "A distraction," she interrupted. "Look at who they sent. New recruits, poorly coordinated. They were meant to tie up your forces here while something else happens." "Where?" Dorian gasped out. She closed her eyes, thinking, if I were planning this, I'd want the king isolated, away from his loyal guards, somewhere he'd feel safe enough to drop his defenses, somewhere symbolic. The throne room, Alaric realized with dawning horror, where he'd just sent 3 of his guards, where the kingdom's most important documents were kept, where the crown itself sat on its pedestal. He was running before the thought finished forming, back through corridors slick with blood, past bodies and broken weapons and the smoking remains of what had been a stable kingdom 6 hours ago. Upstairs, 3 at a time, Dorian and Seraphine somehow keeping pace. The throne room doors were closed. Alaric hit them shoulder first, the reinforced wood splintering under his momentum, and stopped dead. The 3 guards he'd sent were on the floor, dead, throats cut with professional efficiency. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by 50 men in mixed armor and false insignias, was Lord Varric. In his hands he held the crown of Drakkar. "Well," he said with a smile that showed too many teeth, "this is unfortunate timing, Your Majesty." Alaric took in the scene with the speed of long practice. 50 men, all armed, all positioned, exits covered, windows sealed. He had Dorian and Seraphine at his back, and they were exhausted from fighting their way through the palace. The math wasn't good. "Varric," he said, his voice deadly calm, "put down the crown." "I don't think so." Varric turned the ancient circlet in his hands, examining it like it was a curiosity instead of the symbol of centuries of rule. "You know, I've spent 15 years watching you. 15 years of bowing and scraping and pretending to respect a man who inherited everything I had to earn. And do you know what I realized?" Alaric's grip tightened on his sword. "Enlighten me. You're not special. You're not chosen by the gods or blessed by fate or any of that propaganda your family spreads. You're just a man who was born in the right bed. And the thing about men? They die. Just like anyone else." "Is this where you tell me your grand plan?" Alaric asked. "Because I've got to say, Varric, I'm disappointed. I expected better than a standard palace coup." "Oh, this isn't standard." Varric's smile widened. "See, I'm not trying to kill you, Your Majesty. I'm trying to save the kingdom from you." He gestured, and 2 of his men dragged forward a figure in a hooded cloak. The hood came off. Lord Casimir. Eyes wide with terror, a gag in his mouth, hands bound. Varric continued as if he hadn't just revealed a hostage. "House Greythorn controls the eastern trade. House Drax, well, what's left of it, holds the northern mines. House Corvin owns the western farmlands. Between us, we represent 60% of the kingdom's economic power, and we're tired of watching it bleed away to fund your endless wars and brutal enforcement. So what? You kill me and put Casimir on the throne?" Alaric laughed, sharp and bitter. "He's spineless. He'll be dead within a month." "No." Varric dropped the crown carelessly on the throne. "We kill you and dissolve the monarchy. Turn Drakkar into a council of houses. Actual representation instead of genetic tyranny. Noble," Alaric said. "Except you murdered 3 generals and staged a coup that's killed hundreds of innocent people. Doesn't sound like you're interested in representation. Sounds like you're interested in power. And this was the game. The real one. Not the swords and the blood, but this. The words. The positioning." Keep Varric talking while his mind raced through options. Seraphine's voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "Lord Varric," she said, stepping forward calmly, "you're making a mistake." Every weapon in the room turned toward her. Varric's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to tell me?" "The person who actually organized this coup," Seraphine interrupted. The silence that followed could have shattered stone. Alaric felt his blood turn to ice. Varric stared. "What?" Seraphine spread her hands, and suddenly she didn't look like a minor noble anymore. She looked like something ancient and dangerous wearing human skin. "The poisoned generals? My agents? The false uniforms, my design, the coordinated timing, my planning. She smiled, and it was terrible. You didn't stage a coup, Lord Varric. You participated in mine, and you served your purpose beautifully. Alaric's world tilted. The woman he'd trusted, the woman who'd stood beside him through the fighting, the woman who'd been right about everything. She'd been right because she'd planned it all. But then why? Seraphine turned to face Alaric, and her eyes held something that might have been regret. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but this kingdom needed to see its rot exposed, and sometimes the only way to burn out corruption is to drag it into the light. She looked back at Varric. So here we are, the traitor lord, the hostage noble, the king who built an empire on fear. And me. Who the hell are you? Varric demanded. Seraphine Drax, daughter of Marcus Drax, who wasn't killed in a hunting accident. He was murdered for refusing to participate in your conspiracy. Her voice went cold as winter. I've spent 3 months infiltrating your network, learning your codes, tracking your movements, and when I had everything I needed, I accelerated your timeline, made you move before you were ready, forced you into the open where everyone could see exactly what you are. She turned back to Alaric. I'm sorry I had to use you as bait, she said quietly, but I needed him to commit, needed him to reveal himself and his co-conspirators in a way that couldn't be denied or covered up. And I needed you to see what's been growing in the foundations of your kingdom while you've been focused on external threats. Alaric couldn't breathe. The betrayal. The plan within the plan. The absolute audacity of it. And underneath his rage and shock, a tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered, "She's still the smartest person in the room." Varric was screaming orders. His men were moving, weapons raising. The moment before violence erupted. And Seraphine reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small glass vial filled with red liquid. She held it up so everyone could see. This, she said clearly, is Virox extract, highly concentrated. In this room's ventilation system, it would kill everyone in approximately 4 minutes. Painful. Inevitable. No antidote. Varric froze. You're bluffing, he said. Seraphine's smile was as cold as a blade. Try me. The vial caught the torchlight like a drop of frozen blood. Alaric's mind was moving faster than it ever had in battle, calculating angles, measuring distances, counting heartbeats until someone made a move that would get them all killed. Seraphine held the poison steady, her fingers relaxed around the glass. No tremor, no hesitation. Just absolute certainty wrapped in human flesh. This is what separates the survivors from the dead in moments like these. It's not strength or speed or even strategy. It's the ability to hold perfectly still when every instinct screams at you to move, to breathe when your lungs want to panic, to think when your body wants to act. Alaric had learned that lesson young, watched his father execute a room full of conspirators when he was 8 years old, stood there while men begged and screamed and promised anything for mercy. His father hadn't flinched once, just methodical, efficient, cold. The lesson had been clear. Hesitation is death, but this wasn't hesitation. This was Seraphine giving everyone in the room time to understand exactly how thoroughly she'd outplayed them. Varric's face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching terror in the span of 3 heartbeats. His men were looking to him for orders, weapons half raised, not sure if they should attack or retreat or drop to their knees. You're insane, Varric said, and his voice cracked on the last word. You'll kill yourself too. Seraphine tilted her head. Will I? Or do you think someone this far ahead might have taken an antidote before walking into a room full of enemies? The beautiful thing about power plays like this, the really elegant ones, is that the truth doesn't matter nearly as much as what people believe. Alaric had used that principle 100 times. Make them think you have more soldiers than you do. Make them think you're willing to burn everything down rather than negotiate. Make them so uncertain of your limits that they paralyze themselves. Seraphine had just weaponized uncertainty against 50 armed men. Captain Dorian shifted beside Alaric, his breathing harsh and uneven. His hand was still on his sword, but his eyes were locked on Seraphine like she was a serpent that might strike at any second. Your Majesty, Dorian said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and confusion, and something that might have been betrayal. What are your orders? And there it was. The question that mattered. Because everyone in this room, Varric's men, Dorian, even the hostage Casimir gagged and terrified on the floor, they were all waiting to see what the king would do. Would he trust the woman who'd just admitted to orchestrating a coup? Would he side with the traitor lord who'd at least been honest about wanting him dead? Would he cut through the whole mess with steel and sort out the pieces later? This is what they don't tell you about being alpha, about being the one everyone looks to when the world's burning down. It's not about having the right answer. Half the time there isn't one. It's about making a decision and committing to it so completely that everyone else has no choice but to follow. Even when you're not sure. Especially when you're not sure. Alaric looked at Seraphine, really looked at her. Past the composed exterior and the calculated words and the vial of poison she held like a scepter. Her eyes met his, and for just a second, maybe less, he saw something that looked almost like desperation, like she was standing on the same cliff edge he was, and she needed him to jump with her, or they both fell alone. "Lower your weapons," Alaric said. The words hit the room like thunder. Dorian's head whipped toward him. "Your Majesty," she just admitted. "I know what she admitted," Alaric cut him off, his voice hard as iron. "Lower your weapons." Understanding something intellectually and accepting it in your gut are two different animals. Alaric knew that Seraphine had played him, used him, manipulated him like a piece on a board. But he also knew that she could have killed him a dozen times already if that was her goal. Could have let Varric's men do the job. Could have disappeared into the chaos and left him to die. Instead, she was here, weapon in hand, giving him a choice. Sometimes you have to trust the enemy you understand over the ally who's already betrayed you. Dorian lowered his blade slowly, reluctance in every movement. The message was clear. He'd obey, but he didn't like it, and they were going to have words about this later. If there was a later. Varric laughed. It was a strangled, slightly hysterical sound. "You're trusting her? The woman who just confessed to murdering your generals?" "She didn't murder them," Alaric said, moving forward slowly, his own weapon still ready. "You did. Or your people did on your orders. She just made sure the timing worked in her favor. There's a difference." He was close enough now to see the sweat on Varric's face, close enough to smell the fear underneath the expensive oils and perfumes. "Here's what's going to happen," Alaric continued, his voice dropping to something quiet and absolutely lethal. "You're going to put down that crown. You're going to order your men to stand down, and then you're going to tell me the names of every house, every noble, every merchant who's part of your little council conspiracy, every single one. And if I refuse, then Lady Drax drops that vial, and we all die together." Alaric smiled, and it was the expression that had terrified enemies on a dozen battlefields. "But you first, Varric. I'll make sure of that." The calculation happened in Varric's eyes. Alaric could see it, weighing chances, measuring odds, trying to find the angle that let him survive this. But there wasn't one. Seraphine had made sure of that. The crown clattered on the throne as Varric dropped it, his hands shaking. "Stand down," he said to his men, the words coming out bitter as poison. "All of you, stand down." The weapons lowered. Slowly. Grudgingly. But they lowered. Alaric gestured, and Dorian moved immediately, disarming Varric's men with brutal efficiency. The hostage Casimir was cut free, and he scrambled away from the center of the room like a beaten dog. Throughout all of it, Seraphine didn't move, just stood there with that vial held steady, her eyes tracking every person, every movement. Alaric approached her carefully, the same way you'd approach a wolf that might be friendly or might take your throat out. "Are you really going to use that?" he asked quietly. Seraphine smiled. It was the saddest expression he'd ever seen on her face. "It's water with red dye," she said. "There's no such thing as Virox extract. I made it up." The sheer audacity of it hit Alaric like a physical blow. She'd bluffed 50 armed men with colored water and absolute conviction. Had them convinced she'd kill everyone, including herself, on pure presence alone. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met," he said slowly, "or you have a death wish I haven't figured out yet. Neither." Her eyes were still on the crowd of disarmed men. "I just understand something most people don't. The threat of violence is always more powerful than violence itself. Once you actually use it, you've shown your limits. But the threat? The threat can be anything they imagine it to be." She lowered the vial finally, setting it on a nearby table with exaggerated care. The psychology of control, real control, the kind that lasts, comes down to understanding what people fear more than death. For most, it's uncertainty, the unknown. Give someone a clear threat and they'll fight or flee. But make them unsure of the consequences, unsure of your capabilities, unsure of whether you're bluffing or deadly serious, and they'll freeze. They'll wait for someone else to test the waters. That's what Seraphine had just done, weaponized their uncertainty. And Alaric, who'd spent his whole life using similar tactics on battlefields and in throne rooms, recognized the mastery of it, even as part of him wanted to put a blade through her chest for the manipulation. "You've been planning this for months," he said, not a question. Seraphine nodded. "Since my father was killed. Since I realized the corruption went deeper than one or two ambitious lords. It's systemic, Your Majesty. Root and branch. The kingdom you think you rule, it's been rotting from the inside while you've been fighting external threats. And you thought the best way to fix that was to stage a coup? I thought the best way was to make the rot visible." She looked at him directly. "You can't cut out cancer you can't see. So I accelerated the infection, brought it to a head, forced everyone to choose sides in a way that couldn't be hidden or denied." Varric was on his knees now, Dorian's blade at his throat. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving behind the scared old man underneath. "Please," Varric said, the word coming out strangled. "I can give you information, names, resources. Just let me—" Alaric cut him off with a gesture. "The names, now. All of them." What came out in the next 10 minutes was worse than Alaric had imagined. Houses he'd trusted for years, merchants who supplied the palace, 3 members of his own advisory council, even 2 generals he'd thought were loyal, though both were already dead, which explained certain battle losses that had never made strategic sense. The conspiracy had roots everywhere, trade routes, military supplies, food distribution, banking networks. They'd been positioning themselves for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Seraphine had mapped it all, infiltrated it, turned it against itself. When Varric finished talking, his voice was hoarse, and his face was the color of old parchment. Alaric looked at the list of names he'd been writing. 37 in total, 37 people who'd smiled at him, sworn oaths, eaten at his table, all while planning to tear down everything he'd built. The rage that went through him was cold and precise, not the hot fury of battle, something deeper, more dangerous. "Dorian," he said quietly, "take Varric to the deep cells, maximum security, no visitors." "Your Majesty," Varric started, but Dorian hauled him up by the collar and dragged him toward the door before he could finish. The rest of Varric's men were disarmed and bound. Guards, ones Alaric was reasonably sure were still loyal, began hauling them away. The throne room slowly emptied, until it was just Alaric and Seraphine. The silence stretched between them like a blade. "You used me," Alaric said finally. "Yes. You murdered my generals." "No. I told you. Varric's people did that. I just made sure the timing worked in my favor. There's a difference." "Is there?" Alaric moved toward her slowly. "You manipulated events that got people killed. You're telling me that's not the same thing?" Seraphine didn't back away, didn't flinch, just met his approach with that same steady gaze. "Those generals were part of the conspiracy," she said quietly. "All 3 of them. Varric had them killed because they were getting cold feet, starting to doubt the plan. I didn't order their deaths, Your Majesty. I just knew they were coming and used that knowledge. Prove it." She pulled a folded piece of parchment from inside her jacket, handed it to him. Alaric opened it, read it. His blood ran cold. It was a letter from General Thorne to Varric, dated 2 weeks before the general's death, detailing supply routes that would be left vulnerable during the coup, expressing concern about civilian casualties, but ultimately agreeing that the end justified the means. The handwriting was unmistakably Thorne's. "I have documents like this for all 3, Seraphine said. "Took them from Varric's private study 2 weeks ago, along with account ledgers showing payments, meeting schedules, everything you'd need to execute them for treason." Alaric's hand crushed the parchment. His jaw was so tight he could feel his teeth grinding. "Why didn't you just bring me this? Why the elaborate game?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me." She said it simply, like it was obvious. A minor noble with no connections accusing 3 of your most trusted generals of conspiracy? You'd have investigated, sure, but slowly, carefully, through official channels. And by the time you had proof, Varric would have known his network was compromised and disappeared into the political shadows. The rot would have gone deeper underground. So instead, you burned it all down. Instead, I dragged it into the light where you could see it clearly, where the entire palace could see it, where there's no way to deny or minimize or pretend it's an isolated incident. She moved closer to him. This kingdom needed to see its king confronted with the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored, and you needed to see how deep the betrayal ran. There's a particular kind of pain that comes with discovering everyone you trusted has been lying to you. It's not the sharp agony of a blade. It's slower, deeper, like drowning in cold water while everyone watches from the shore. Alaric had felt betrayal before, lost friends in politics and war. But this was different. This was structural, systemic. The very foundation of his rule had been compromised, and he hadn't even known it. And the worst part, the woman standing in front of him, the one who'd exposed it all, was still playing games with him, still manipulating, still 3 moves ahead. "How do I know you're not part of it too?" he asked. "How do I know this isn't just you eliminating competition so you can take Varric's place?" Seraphine's expression flickered. Just for a moment, something that might have been hurt. "You don't," she said quietly. "You'll have to decide whether to trust me based on actions, not words. And I understand that's asking a lot from a man who's just learned his entire inner circle was compromised." She moved to the window, looked out over the city still burning in places from the fighting. "My father was a good man," she continued, her voice softer now. "Honest, fair, believed in the rule of law and the sanctity of oaths. When Varric approached him about the conspiracy, he refused, reported it through proper channels, filed complaints, followed procedure." She turned back to face Alaric. "They killed him for it, made it look like an accident, and then they approached the next noble in line, and the next, until they found people willing to play along. That's when I realized the system itself was broken, that proper channels were part of the problem, that the only way to save the kingdom was to break the rules everyone else was hiding behind." Alaric studied her face, looking for tells, for lies, for any sign that this was another manipulation. But all he saw was exhaustion. Real human exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying a terrible weight alone for too long. "What do you want?" he asked. "Really want?" "I want the kingdom to survive." She said it like a prayer, like something she'd been repeating to herself through long, dark nights. "I want the corruption cut out. I want a system where noble houses can't conspire against the crown because the crown is strong enough to hold them accountable. I want what you want, Your Majesty, a kingdom that works." "And what about you? Where do you fit in this new kingdom?" Seraphine smiled. It was tired and genuine and almost beautiful. "Wherever you decide I belong. Execute me for treason if you think that serves justice. Put me in a cell next to Varric, or use me, my intelligence network, my strategic mind, whatever helps the kingdom survive." She moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell blood and smoke, and underneath it, something like lavender. "But make the choice consciously," she said. "Don't let anger or pride or wounded trust decide for you. You're better than that. You're the kind of king who can see past personal betrayal to what the kingdom needs." And that was the trap, wasn't it? The perfect manipulation. Appeal to his better nature. Make him think choosing her was the noble strategic choice rather than an emotional one. Except she was right. Damn her, she was right. The kingdom needed someone who could see these patterns. Someone ruthless enough to do what was necessary. Someone who'd proven she could outthink an entire conspiracy and turn it against itself. And if Alaric executed her for that, he'd be letting pride override necessity. Decisions like this, the ones that shape kingdoms, they don't come with clear right answers. You choose based on incomplete information and hope you're not damning everyone who depends on you. Alaric made his choice. "You work for me now," he said. Directly. No intermediaries. No secrets. You tell me everything you know, everyone you've compromised, every piece of intelligence you have. And if I find out you're playing me again, "I'm not," Seraphine interrupted. "I'm done playing games. This was always about saving the kingdom, and I think you finally see that, maybe." Alaric moved to the throne, picked up the crown that Varric had dropped, felt the weight of it, the cold metal and ancient responsibility. "Or maybe I'm making the biggest mistake of my life trusting you." He set the crown back on its pedestal. but I'm tired of living in a kingdom where everyone's an enemy. So we try something different. We burn out the corruption together, and if you betray me, I'll make sure you die slowly enough to regret it." "Understood?" Seraphine said. The doors to the throne room opened. Captain Dorian returned, his armor still bloody, his face grim. "The palace is secured, Your Majesty. We've got 43 prisoners, including Varric, another 60 dead on both sides. The fighting in the city has mostly stopped, but there's still chaos in the market district." Alaric nodded. "Send messengers to the loyal houses. Tell them I'm calling an emergency council at dawn. Anyone who doesn't show answers to me personally." "And the prisoners?" "Hold them. We'll sort through who was actually part of the conspiracy and who was just following bad orders." Alaric looked at Seraphine. "Lady Drax will help with the interrogations." Dorian's expression went cold. "Your Majesty, with respect, putting her in charge of—" "She knows more about this conspiracy than anyone alive," Alaric cut him off. "She's the reason we're having this conversation instead of planning my funeral. So yes, Captain, she'll help, and you'll cooperate." The two of them stared at each other, Dorian's loyalty to Alaric warring with his distrust of Seraphine. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. "As you command." He left, and the silence returned. Seraphine was looking at Alaric with something like surprise. "You defended me. Don't get used to it." Alaric felt the exhaustion hitting him now, the adrenaline bleeding away to leave behind bone-deep weariness. "I still don't trust you, but I need you. There's a difference." "Is there?" Seraphine asked, echoing his earlier words. "Yes. Trust is earned over time. Need is immediate. Right now I need your mind and your network more than I need revenge for being manipulated." He moved to one of the windows. The city spread out below, fires still burning in places. His city, his kingdom, bought with blood and held by force, and apparently rotting underneath while he'd been looking the other way. "How did I miss it?" he asked quietly. "How did I not see what was happening in my own court?" Seraphine joined him at the window. "Because you were looking at external threats," she said. "Border wars, trade disputes, succession challenges from rival kingdoms. Your attention was where it needed to be for immediate survival. The conspiracy counted on that. They moved slowly, carefully, built their network over years while you were fighting battles. That's not an excuse. No. But it's an explanation." She looked at him. "You're not omniscient, Your Majesty. You're just one man trying to hold together a kingdom that everyone else is trying to tear apart. The fact that you've survived this long says more about your strength than missing one conspiracy says about your weakness." Pretty words, true ones. They stood there in silence, watching the city slowly calm, watching fires burn themselves out, watching guards patrol streets and citizens emerge cautiously from barricaded homes. This is what leadership looks like in the moments between crises. Not the decisive action or the stirring speech, just two people standing in the wreckage of their plans, trying to figure out how to build something better from the ashes. "Tomorrow," Alaric said, "we start rebuilding. Root out every conspirator, reform the council, make an example brutal enough that nobody tries this again for a generation." "And tonight?" Seraphine asked. "Tonight I figure out if I'm going to sleep or if I'm going to execute you in your bed just to be safe." She looked at him sharply, trying to determine if he was serious. Alaric let her wonder for a few seconds, then almost smiled. "I'm joking. Mostly." The council at dawn came together like a wounded animal crawling to water. 17 houses sent representatives. 8 seats sat conspicuously empty. Those were the ones on Seraphine's list, the ones being held in cells or dead from the fighting. Alaric sat on his throne in full armor, the crown on his head feeling heavier than it ever had. Seraphine stood to his right, Captain Dorian to his left, a united front that fooled exactly nobody. The assembled nobles were scared. Good. Fear kept people honest when nothing else would. "Last night," Alaric began, his voice carrying through the chamber, "this kingdom almost fell. Not to external invasion, not to natural disaster, but to betrayal from within, from people who swore oaths and broke them, from houses that claimed loyalty while sharpening knives in the dark." He let that sit for a moment. "I have names. I have proof. I have confessions. And over the next week, I'm going to dismantle every house, every merchant network, every banking connection that was part of this conspiracy." One of the nobles, Lord Brennan, elderly and sharp-eyed, raised his hand. Your Majesty, if I may, how do we know these accusations are legitimate? How do we know this isn't simply a purge of your political enemies? Alaric smiled. It was not a kind expression. Because if I wanted to purge my enemies, Lord Brennan, I wouldn't bother with trials or evidence. I'd just kill you all and let the gods sort it out. The fact that I'm showing you proof means I still have some faith in the system. He gestured, and Dorian stepped forward with a stack of documents. Letters. Ledgers. Signed confessions. The accumulated evidence of months of conspiracy. Seraphine had organized it all, made it clear and undeniable. The nobles read in silence, faces going pale, hands shaking. Some of them had probably known. Others were genuinely surprised, but all of them understood the implications. 37 houses were involved, Alaric continued. 37 families who decided their ambition mattered more than the kingdom's stability. Some of them are represented in this room. The tension ratcheted up another notch. I'm giving you one chance. He leaned forward. One opportunity to save your house from complete destruction. If you were part of this, you have until sunset today to confess. Bring me proof of your involvement, names of your co-conspirators, everything you know. Do that, and I'll show mercy. Your house will be fined, stripped of titles, but allowed to survive. And if we don't confess, someone asked from the back, then when I find you, and I will find you, I'll execute you, your children, your spouse. Anyone who could claim your titles or lands. I'll burn your house to the ground and salt the earth so nothing grows there again. I'll make you a cautionary tale that parents tell their children for the next 100 years. The room had gone absolutely silent. This is how you rebuild after betrayal. Not with gentle reformation or measured justice. With overwhelming force and the promise of annihilation for anyone who steps out of line again. It's brutal. It's harsh. But it works. By sunset, 12 nobles had confessed, brought documentation, named names. Some were crying, some were defiant. All of them were terrified. Alaric kept his word. Fines, loss of titles, exile for the worst offenders. But their families lived. The ones who didn't confess? They found out the hard way that Alaric didn't make empty threats. 5 houses were completely eliminated, land seized, assets distributed, names erased from the kingdom's records. The executions were public, efficient, brutal. Seraphine watched it all from the palace walls, her face unreadable. Does it bother you? Alaric asked, standing beside her as the last of the condemned were led to the block. Yes, she said quietly, and no. It's necessary. That doesn't make it easy to watch. You set this in motion. I know. Her hands were gripping the wall edge. I'll carry that weight the rest of my life. Below them, the executioner's axe fell. The crowd roared, justice or bloodlust, depending on who you asked. This is the price of power. Not the glory or the wealth or the authority. The weight of decisions that damn people. The knowledge that your choices end lives. The understanding that sometimes the right thing and the good thing aren't the same. Alaric had made peace with that years ago, but watching Seraphine struggle with it reminded him that she was still learning, still human underneath the strategic brilliance. 2 weeks after the purge, the kingdom had stabilized. New generals appointed, new council members selected, trade routes secured. The conspiracy's network dismantled piece by piece, and through it all Seraphine worked. 18-hour days organizing intelligence, interrogating prisoners, building new systems to prevent this from happening again. She was brilliant, ruthless when necessary, surprisingly compassionate when it didn't compromise security. And Alaric found himself trusting her more each day. Not completely, maybe never completely, but enough. Late one night, he found her in the archive room, surrounded by documents and maps and half-empty cups of cold tea. You should sleep, he said. She looked up and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. So should you. Fair point. He moved into the room, looking at what she was working on. What's this? A new intelligence network. She pointed to a map with colored markers. I'm establishing agents in every major house. Not spies exactly. More like observers. People who can spot patterns like this conspiracy before they metastasize. You're building a surveillance state. I'm building an early warning system. There's a difference. Is there? Alaric asked for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Seraphine actually laughed. It was tired and genuine. Yes, Your Majesty. Surveillance for control is tyranny. Surveillance for security is practical. The question is which one you choose to build. And which one are you building? I don't know yet. She set down her pen. Ask me in a year. They stood there in the quiet archive, surrounded by the accumulated history of a kingdom that had almost destroyed itself. Thank you, Alaric said suddenly. Seraphine looked surprised. For what? For saving my kingdom. Even if your methods were unconventional. You're welcome. She hesitated, then added, Thank you for not executing me. The night is still young. She smiled. That joke is getting old, Your Majesty. Then I should probably find new material. It was the closest thing to normal conversation they'd had since this all started. And it felt almost comfortable. Almost like they might actually be able to work together without constant suspicion. Almost. The courier arrived 3 days later. Dirty from hard riding, bleeding from a wound in his side, carrying a message sealed with black wax. Alaric read it twice, then handed it to Seraphine. Her face went white. When? She asked. The messenger said they crossed the northern border 2 days ago, 20,000 strong, maybe more. An army. A real one. From the Korthak Empire to the north, moving toward the capital with siege equipment and supply trains and clear hostile intent. And Drekker's military was in shambles. Generals dead or disgraced. Troops scattered. Supply lines disrupted from the purge. They knew, Seraphine said quietly, the conspiracy. They were working with Korthak, weakening us from inside so the invasion would succeed. Alaric felt everything crystallize with terrible clarity. This wasn't over. The coup had just been the opening move. The real war was about to begin. And they had maybe a week before 20,000 enemy soldiers reached the capital walls. He looked at Seraphine, saw the same realization in her eyes, the same calculation of impossible odds. How many men can we field? He asked. Maybe 8,000. If we conscript and arm civilians, maybe 12. Against 20,000 trained soldiers. Yes, the math was brutal, the odds were worse. But Alaric had fought impossible battles before. Never quite this impossible, though. We need a strategy, he said. Something that evens the odds. Seraphine was already thinking. He could see it in her eyes. That brilliant, ruthless mind spinning through possibilities. I have an idea, she said slowly. But you're not going to like it. Tell me anyway. We surrender. Alaric stared at her, waiting for the punchline. Waiting for her to smile and say she was joking. She didn't. Are you insane? He demanded. We don't surrender. We fight. We die first. No. She moved to the map, pointing at the northern approach. We appear to surrender, send envoys, negotiate terms, buy time, while we what? Hope they get bored and go home? While we use every dirty trick, every psychological weapon, every advantage we can manufacture to turn their victory into a trap. She looked at him with those winter eyes. You've been fighting conventional wars your whole life, Your Majesty. Armies against armies. But I've been fighting a different kind of war. One where the winner is whoever controls the information and the perception. This is different. This is 20,000 actual soldiers with actual weapons. So we make them fight on our terms instead of theirs. We make them cautious. We make them paranoid. We turn their strength into weakness. She grabbed his arm, urgent now. Trust me. One more time. Trust me and I'll give you a victory that saves the kingdom. Alaric looked at her hand on his arm, at her face intense with desperate certainty, at the map showing an army that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1, and he thought about everything that had happened. The coup, the purge, the impossible odds she'd already beaten with nothing but psychology and timing. If he said no, they'd fight conventionally and probably lose. If he said yes, they'd try something insane and probably lose. But at least the second option was interesting. I'm going to regret this, he said. Probably. Seraphine's smile was fierce and terrible. But you'll be alive to regret it. The envoys rode out the next morning under a white flag carrying Alaric's terms of negotiation. And in the palace, Seraphine began implementing a plan that would either save the kingdom or doom it completely. There was no middle ground anymore, no safe choices, just the cliff edge and the jump. And this time, Alaric was jumping without knowing if there was ground beneath him or just empty air and a very long fall. The war room smelled like old leather and desperation. Alaric stood over the map table, his hands braced on either side of a kingdom that was about to be crushed. Wooden markers represented the Korthak army advancing from the north, 20,000 strong, maybe more. The scouts kept revising the numbers upward with each report. His own forces looked pathetic by comparison. 8 markers scattered across the defensive positions, 8,000 men who were supposed to hold back a flood. Seraphine was moving pieces on the board with surgical precision, repositioning units, drawing lines that represented supply routes and communication channels. She'd been at this for 6 hours straight without stopping. No food, no rest, just constant motion and calculation. Captain Dorian stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching her with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for vipers in tall grass. The thing about desperate situations is they force you to see people clearly, strip away the politeness and the social games and show you who someone really is when everything's on the line. Some people freeze, some panic, some rise to meet the moment. Seraphine was building a war strategy like she was composing music, every move deliberate, every choice supporting the next. It was beautiful in a terrible way. "Your envoys should reach the Korthak vanguard by noon tomorrow," she said, without looking up. "That gives us maybe 36 hours before they respond." "And what exactly are we offering them?" Dorian asked, his voice sharp with barely controlled anger. "Surrender? Tribute? The keys to the capital?" Seraphine finally looked up. "Time, Captain. We're offering them time to consider terms while we prepare something they won't see coming." "Which is what exactly?" She smiled. It was cold enough to freeze blood. Psychological warfare, information control, strategic deception. Everything they don't teach in your military academies because they're too focused on honorable combat. Dorian's jaw tightened. "There's honor in... There's survival," Seraphine cut him off. "Or there's death. Honor is what you worry about after you've won." Alaric watched the exchange with something approaching fascination. These two represented everything pulling at him from different directions. Dorian was tradition, loyalty, the old ways of doing things. Seraphine was adaptation, ruthlessness, the brutal efficiency required for survival. And somewhere between them was the king he was supposed to be. "Enough," Alaric said quietly. "Both of you. Dorian, I need you to oversee the conscription efforts. Get every able-bodied man between 16 and 40 ready to fight. Armor them with whatever we have left. Train them if there's time." "Your Majesty, that's..." Dorian started. "Not a suggestion." Alaric's voice went hard. "An order. We need bodies on the walls. I don't care if they're farmers or merchants or bakers. We arm them and we use them." Dorian's face went rigid. Then he saluted sharply and left without another word. The door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. "He hates me," Seraphine observed. "He hates what you represent." Alaric moved to the window overlooking the city. The streets were already filling with people preparing for siege, boarding windows, stockpiling food, sending their children to relatives in the countryside if they had any. Change. The end of certainty. He's a soldier. Soldiers need clear enemies and clear orders. You're neither. And what am I? Alaric turned to look at her, still trying to figure that out. She held his gaze for a long moment, then went back to the map. "The northern approach is our best defensive position," she said, pointing. "The terrain funnels them into a killing field. Standard siege tactics would have them set up here, bombard the walls, wait for starvation or disease to do most of the work. But they're not going to do that." She moved a marker representing the enemy commander. "Because I'm going to give them something more valuable than a slow victory." "Enlighten me." Seraphine's finger traced a route from the north gate to the palace. "I'm going to offer them you." The silence that followed was absolute. Alaric felt something cold settle in his chest. The same feeling he got before battles when he knew the plan was going to cost him people he cared about. "Explain," he said carefully. "The envoy isn't just negotiating terms. They're carrying a message that you're willing to surrender personally. Meet with the Korthak commander. Discuss transition of power. Everything they want served on a silver platter." She looked up. "And when they come to collect, we'll be ready." "Ready how?" "That's the part you're not going to like." Over the next 12 hours, Seraphine laid out a plan so audacious and insane that Alaric almost laughed. Almost. It required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a level of risk that made conventional warfare look safe by comparison. The core concept was simple. The Korthak commander, a man named General Vorath, according to intelligence reports, was ambitious and overconfident. He'd spent 6 months planning this invasion, coordinating with the conspiracy inside Drakkar, positioning his forces for maximum impact. He expected victory, anticipated glory, probably already had his acceptance speech prepared for when he rode through the capital gates as conqueror. Seraphine intended to give him exactly what he expected, right up until the moment she took it away. The plan required Alaric to actually meet with Vorath, actually negotiate. Get close enough to the enemy commander that personal betrayal became possible. It was suicidal, brilliant, completely insane. So of course Alaric agreed to it, because what choice did he have? Fight conventionally and lose slowly? This way at least offered a chance, however slim. The scouts reported back that evening. The Korthak army had stopped advancing, set up a temporary camp 15 miles north of the capital. They were considering the surrender terms. Good, Seraphine said when she heard. That means Vorath is intrigued. Overconfident commanders always are. They can't resist the easy victory. She was in her element now, moving through the palace like a shadow, organizing intelligence assets, positioning people in places Alaric didn't even know existed. He'd given her authority to act in his name, and she was using it with surgical precision. Too much precision, maybe. Late that night, Alaric found Captain Dorian in the barracks, overseeing the training of newly conscripted civilians. Men who'd been shopkeepers and farmers yesterday were trying to learn which end of a sword to hold. It was pathetic and heartbreaking and absolutely necessary. "Walk with me," Alaric said quietly. They moved through the palace grounds in silence. Guards saluted as they passed. Torches cast long shadows on ancient stone. The air smelled like metal and fear. "You don't trust her," Alaric said finally. It wasn't a question. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. Then, "No, Your Majesty, I don't." "Why?" "Because she appeared out of nowhere right when the kingdom started falling apart. Because she always has the perfect answer. Because she's too smart and too careful and too many steps ahead." Dorian stopped walking. Because people who manipulate that well don't suddenly stop just because they're on your side now. Alaric had been thinking the same thing. Hadn't wanted to admit it even to himself. But hearing Dorian say it out loud made it real. "You think she's still playing me?" "I think she's playing everyone, including herself maybe. I don't know what her endgame is." Dorian looked at him directly. "But I know soldiers, and she's not one. She's something else entirely." The question hanging between them was obvious. What do you do with someone that dangerous? Someone you need but can't trust? "Keep watching her," Alaric said quietly. "If she makes a move against the kingdom, I want to know immediately. And if she makes a move against you, then you do what's necessary to protect the throne." Dorian nodded slowly. "Understood." They walked back in silence, and Alaric felt the weight of every decision pressing down on him like a physical thing. The weight of trusting someone he shouldn't, of knowing he might be making the biggest mistake of his life, and doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. This is what leadership costs. Not just the lives you spend in battle, but the piece of yourself you lose every time you choose pragmatism over principle. Every time you use people like tools and tell yourself it's for the greater good. His father had understood that, had made those choices without hesitation. Died alone and unmourned because everyone who might have loved him had learned to fear him instead. Alaric had sworn he'd be different, better. But here he was, making the same calculations, using the same ruthless logic. Maybe there was no other way to rule. Maybe the throne demanded this price from everyone who sat on it. The reply from General Vorath came the next morning. He would meet with King Alaric. Neutral ground, 5 miles north of the capital. Both parties limited to 10 guards each. Tomorrow at noon. It was exactly what Seraphine had predicted. She smiled when she read the message, like a chess player watching their opponent walk into a trap. "He's arrogant," she said. "Thinks he's being clever by limiting guards. Thinks 10 men will be enough to capture or kill you if negotiations fail." And will they be? No. Because we'll have 50 men hidden in the terrain around the meeting point. Because I've already bribed 3 of his personal guard. Because we're going to poison his wine before he even arrives at the table. She looked at Alaric. This is what real war looks like, Your Majesty. Not glorious, not honorable, just effective. And what happens after? Alaric asked. Assuming your plan works and we kill or capture Vorath, his army is still out there. 20,000 men who will be very angry that we murdered their commander under a flag of truce. Then we use his death as leverage. Seraphine pulled out a document covered in dense handwriting. Vorath has a second in command, Colonel Dristan. Competent but uninspired. We send him proof that Vorath was planning to betray the Korthak Emperor. Use the invasion as a springboard for his own ambitions. Documentation that implicates him in conspiracy against his own throne. Do we have that documentation? We will by tomorrow morning. She said it so casually, like forging treason was something she did every day before breakfast. And this is where Alaric should have stopped. Should have drawn a line. Should have said that there were limits to what he'd do even to save his kingdom. But he didn't. Because the truth was, he'd crossed those lines years ago. Had made choices in war that kept him awake at night. Had ordered executions that were expedient rather than just. Had built his rule on the same ruthless foundation his father had. The only difference was, he'd been lying to himself about it. Pretending he was better, more moral. Seraphine wasn't lying to anyone, least of all herself. Do it, he said. The meeting ground was a stretch of flat grassland between two low hills, perfect for observing, terrible for hiding, which was exactly why Seraphine had spent the last 18 hours having troops dig concealed positions into those hills, covered with grass and branches and enough patience to wait for the signal. Alaric rode out at dawn with 9 hand-picked guards. Captain Dorian was one of them. The other 8 were men who'd proven themselves in combat, men who'd follow orders even when those orders were terrible. Seraphine had wanted to come. Alaric had refused. Your face is too valuable, he'd told her. If this goes wrong and I die, the kingdom needs someone who knows what's actually happening. She'd accepted that with a nod that might have been respect or might have been calculation. Hard to tell with her. The ride north was quiet except for the jingle of armor and the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth. The morning was cold, clear. The kind of day that should have been beautiful if it wasn't potentially the last one Alaric would see. They reached the meeting point an hour before noon, set up a simple table and chairs, waited. One of the critical skills they never teach you about warfare is waiting. Not the tactical kind where you're watching for enemy movement. The psychological kind where you're sitting with your own thoughts and the growing certainty that you're about to do something incredibly stupid. Alaric had gotten good at waiting. At controlling the fear that wanted to turn into panic, at keeping his hands steady and his face calm while his mind ran through every way this could go wrong. The Korthak delegation appeared on the northern horizon at noon exactly. 12 riders, not 10. Already breaking the agreement, Alaric's hand moved to his sword instinctively. Beside him, Dorian tensed. Easy, Alaric said quietly. Let's see what they're playing at. The riders approached slowly, deliberately, making a show of their confidence. General Vorath was easy to identify. He rode at the center of the formation on a massive warhorse, his armor polished to mirror brightness, a cape of deep red flowing behind him. He was younger than Alaric expected, maybe 40, strong features, cold eyes that measured everything, the kind of man who'd burned villages and called it strategy. They dismounted 50 feet from the table. Vorath's guards fanned out in a loose perimeter. Professional. Well-trained, hands near weapons but not quite touching them. Vorath himself walked forward alone. That took courage or stupidity. Alaric hadn't decided which yet. King Alaric, Vorath said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. I appreciate you accepting my invitation. Your invitation? Alaric stood slowly. I was under the impression I'd invited you. Vorath smiled. Let's call it mutual interest then. They stood on opposite sides of the table. 2 men, 2 armies, 2 kingdoms balanced on whatever happened in the next few minutes. You've come to negotiate your surrender, Vorath said. Smart. Saves lives on both sides. I can respect that. I've come to hear your terms, Alaric corrected. Whether I accept them is another matter. The terms are simple. Vorath pulled out a scroll. Drucker becomes a vassal state of the Korthak Empire. You retain your throne but answer to our emperor. Your military is disbanded. Your treasury pays tribute. Your nobles swear new oaths. He slid the scroll across the table. Sign this and we can avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Alaric picked up the scroll. Read it slowly. Every word was designed to strip away sovereignty while maintaining the appearance of autonomy. It was elegant in its brutality. And if I refuse, then we take the capital by force, kill everyone who resists, burn what's left, install a governor who will be more cooperative. Vorath leaned forward. You're a military man, Your Majesty. You know the math. You can't win this fight. Math isn't everything, Alaric said. No. But it's enough. Vorath's smile widened. You're beaten. You know it. Your conspiracy network inside the kingdom has been exposed and dismantled. Your military is in shambles. Your nobles are terrified. The only question is how many of your people die before you accept reality. And there it was, the confirmation Alaric had been waiting for. So you were working with the conspiracy, he said carefully. Of course. Vorath said it like it was obvious. How do you think we knew exactly when to strike? When your defenses would be weakest? He laughed. You've been dancing to our tune for months, Alaric. You just didn't know it. The rage that went through Alaric was white-hot and carefully controlled, because Vorath was right. The timing had been too perfect. The conspiracy too coordinated with external threats. Someone had been feeding intelligence to the Korthak Empire from inside Drakkar. Someone who knew enough to orchestrate everything. Someone like Seraphine. The thought hit him like a blade between the ribs. No, that was impossible. She'd exposed the conspiracy, helped him dismantle it, saved his kingdom. Except she'd also controlled every piece of information, directed every interrogation, been the sole source for most of the intelligence about who was involved and how deep it went. What if she hadn't been exposing a conspiracy? What if she'd been eliminating competition? His mind raced through the implications. The generals who'd died had been loyal to Varric. The houses that had been purged had been his strongest supporters. Seraphine had systematically removed everyone who might have opposed a Korthak invasion, and then she'd positioned herself as Alaric's most trusted advisor, the one person with access to everything, every defensive position, every strategic plan, every weakness in the kingdom's armor. She told him exactly what he needed to hear to trust her, and he'd been stupid enough to believe it. The world tilted. Everything he thought he knew rearranging itself into a new and terrible pattern. Vorath was still talking. Something about tribute schedules and administrative transition. But Alaric wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about Seraphine standing in the war room, moving pieces on the board, offering him salvation wrapped in brilliant strategy. He was thinking about how she'd known exactly where Varric would be, exactly what evidence to provide, exactly how to make herself indispensable. He was thinking about 50 men hidden in the hills around this meeting point, men positioned by someone who might have given their locations to the enemy. Captain Dorian caught his eye. Saw something in Alaric's expression. His hand moved to his sword. Something's wrong, Dorian mouthed silently. Alaric gave the smallest nod. Then the arrows started falling. Not from the hills where his men were hidden, from behind them, from positions that shouldn't have existed. His guards went down in seconds. Dorian took an arrow through the shoulder and dropped to one knee. Another guard's throat opened in a spray of red. Alaric drew his sword and threw himself behind the table as the world exploded into chaos. Vorath was laughing, actually laughing as more Korthak soldiers emerged from concealment. Not 12, not 20. Hundreds of them pouring out of positions that Alaric's own scouts should have found. Positions that someone must have helped them establish. Your strategist sends her regards, Vorath called out over the sound of combat. Brilliant woman, thorough. She gave us everything we needed to turn your own trap against you. Alaric's world narrowed to pure survival. He came up fighting. His blade took a Korthak soldier in the gut, reversed and opened another's throat, moved like water through opponents who were good, but not good enough. But there were too many, always too many. Dorian was still fighting, 3 arrows in him now, but refusing to go down. 2 other guards were making a last stand back to back. The rest were already dead. A blade caught Alaric across the ribs. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to hurt. He killed the man who'd struck him and turned to find 5 more taking his place. This was it. The end. Betrayed by the woman he'd trusted and about to die in a field because he'd been too proud to see the trap. Then horns sounded from the south. Not Korthak horns. Drakkar horns. The signal for cavalry charge. Riders poured over the southern hill, 200 of them in formation, fresh armor, sharp weapons, led by a figure in dark green who rode like she'd been born in a saddle. Seraphine. She hit the Korthak flank like a hammer. Her cavalry carved through them with brutal efficiency, scattered them, broke their formation. Alaric stood in the center of carnage, bleeding and confused and absolutely certain he'd lost his mind, because Seraphine had just saved him from an ambush that she'd supposedly arranged. Unless she'd arranged both, the ambush and the rescue, played every side against each other so thoroughly that nobody could tell which way was up. The fighting ended quickly once the cavalry arrived. Vorath tried to rally his men, but an arrow took him in the chest. He went down hard. Seraphine dismounted and walked calmly through the battlefield, stepped over bodies like they were stones in a stream, stopped in front of Alaric. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He stared at her. This woman who'd just saved his life or doomed him, or both simultaneously. "What the hell just happened?" he managed. "Vorath was lying," she said simply. "I didn't give him anything, but I knew he'd claim I did. Knew he'd try to turn you against me right before springing his real trap. So I prepared for both scenarios. Both scenarios. The trap he set, and the trap I set for his trap." She looked at the battlefield. The Korthak soldiers surrendering or dying. This was always going to be the outcome. The only question was whether you'd trust me long enough to see it. Alaric felt something break inside him, some last piece of certainty that he'd been holding on to. "How do I know you're telling the truth now?" he asked quietly. "You don't." Seraphine met his eyes. "You never will. That's the price of working with someone like me. Constant uncertainty, constant doubt. But the kingdom is still standing. You're still alive. And the invasion force just lost their commander and a third of their strength." She was right. Pragmatically, strategically, she was absolutely right. And that made it worse somehow, because Alaric couldn't tell if he'd just witnessed incredible loyalty or the most sophisticated manipulation he'd ever seen. Captain Dorian staggered over, bleeding from multiple wounds but alive. He looked at Seraphine with naked hatred. "She's going to kill you eventually," he said to Alaric. "Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But someone that twisted, that comfortable with lies, she'll turn on you when it serves her purpose." "Perhaps," Seraphine said calmly. "Or perhaps I'm the only reason he's survived this long. Hard to say, really." Alaric looked between them, his oldest friend bleeding and furious, the woman who'd saved his kingdom or destroyed it or both. And he realized with terrible clarity that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, had entered a world where truth and lies blurred together, where loyalty and betrayal wore the same face, where he could never be certain of anything again. The Korthak prisoners were being rounded up. The wounded were being treated. The battle was over. But the war inside Alaric's head had just begun. That night, back in the palace, he found Seraphine in the archive room again, always working, always planning. "Did you really betray me to Vorath?" he asked without preamble. She looked up from her documents. "No. Can you prove it?" "No." She set down her pen. "That's the problem with this kind of warfare, Your Majesty. Proof doesn't exist, only results. You have to decide what to believe based on outcomes rather than evidence. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." She stood, moved closer. "I could show you forged documents proving my loyalty, or forged documents proving my betrayal. You'd never know which were real. So instead I'm telling you the truth. You'll never be certain of me. Ever. The question is whether you can live with that uncertainty. And if I can't, then kill me now. Put a blade through my heart and sleep easier at night knowing you've eliminated the threat." Seraphine spread her arms. "I won't resist, won't fight back. If you genuinely believe executing me serves the kingdom better than using me, then do it." She meant it. He could see that. This woman who'd orchestrated impossible victories and maybe impossible treacheries was offering him her life without hesitation. It should have made the choice easier. It made it infinitely harder. Because Alaric realized that killing her wouldn't bring certainty, wouldn't bring peace, would just be one more decision made out of fear rather than strategy. And he was so tired of being afraid. He was tired of second-guessing every alliance, tired of seeing betrayal in every shadow, tired of the weight that came with trusting nobody and nothing. Maybe that was the real trap. Not the battlefield ambush or the palace conspiracy, but this, the erosion of his ability to trust anything at all. The slow poison that turned him into someone who saw enemies everywhere and allies nowhere. His father had died that way. Alone in a locked room because he couldn't trust anyone to guard the door. Alaric refused to become that. "I'm not going to kill you," he said finally. "Why not?" "Because you're right. I need you. The kingdom needs you. And I'm choosing to believe that whatever game you're playing, it ends with Drakkar still standing." He moved to the window. "Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're manipulating me right now. But I'm making a conscious choice to trust you anyway." "That's incredibly foolish," Seraphine said quietly. "Probably. But it's also the only way forward I can see. So we move forward together and hope I'm not making the mistake that ends us both." Seraphine was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Alaric looked at her directly. "Because if I find out you actually did betray me, if this was all an elaborate setup, I won't kill you quickly. I'll make you watch everything you built burn first. Every plan, every network, every piece of this kingdom you claim to be saving. I'll tear it down in front of you before I end your life. Understood?" "Understood." They stood there in the archive room, surrounded by documents and maps and the accumulated history of a kingdom that kept almost dying. And Alaric made peace with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that he'd never be completely sure, with the understanding that this was what survival looked like in the modern world. Not honor or glory or certainty, just pragmatism and calculated risk and the willingness to work with people you couldn't fully trust because the alternative was worse. The reports came in over the next 3 days. The Korthak army was in retreat. Their second-in-command, Colonel Dristan, had received the forged documents implicating Vorath in treason, had seen the massacre of their vanguard as evidence that Vorath's plans were compromised. He'd ordered a withdrawal rather than risk the same trap. It shouldn't have worked. The forgery was good, but not perfect. The story had holes. But Seraphine had understood something crucial. People believe what makes sense to them. And to a cautious second-in-command who'd always suspected his ambitious superior of overreach, the idea that Vorath had doomed them with his arrogance made perfect sense. The invasion was over. Drakkar had survived. And Alaric sat on his throne feeling like he'd won and lost simultaneously. Captain Dorian recovered from his wounds, but his distrust of Seraphine only deepened. Half the court was loyal to her. The other half wanted her executed. The kingdom was split between those who saw her as savior and those who saw her as the greatest threat they'd ever faced. And at the center of it all, Alaric ruled a kingdom he no longer fully understood. Seraphine continued her work, building networks, gathering intelligence, positioning pieces for games that wouldn't pay off for years. Late one night, Alaric found himself back in the throne room, alone, the crown sitting on its pedestal catching torchlight. He picked it up, felt the weight of it. This is what power costs, he thought. Not just the lives lost in battle or the enemies crushed, but the piece of your soul you trade for survival, the certainty you give up, the trust you learn to live without. His father had paid that price and died empty. Alaric was paying it now and didn't know what would be left of him when it was done. But the kingdom was still standing. His people were alive. The invasion had failed. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. He set the crown back down and walked out of the throne room. Tomorrow, there would be more decisions, more impossible choices, more battles fought with words and shadows instead of steel. But tonight, he would sleep. And he would try not to dream of the woman who'd saved him, or destroyed him, or both, and the growing certainty that he'd never know which was true. Because that was the real twist. Not the battlefield ambush or the revealed conspiracy, but the understanding that from now on, every victory would taste like poison. Every alliance would feel like betrayal waiting to happen. And the king who'd built his rule on certainty and strength would spend the rest of his life guessing whether the ground beneath him was solid or about to give way. That was Seraphine's true gift. Not saving his kingdom, but teaching him that survival meant living with permanent uncertainty and forcing him to choose it anyway. Because the alternative, the isolation, the paranoia, the slow death of trusting nothing, was worse than the risk of being wrong. So Alaric chose to trust, chose to believe, chose to work with someone who might destroy him. Not because it was safe, but because it was the only way to remain human while wearing a crown. And that choice, that terrible necessary choice would define everything that came after. The first assassination attempt came 3 weeks after the Korthak retreat. Alaric was in the training yard, working through sword forms with Captain Dorian. The morning was cold enough to turn their breath into fog. Sweat mixed with the chill air, steam rising from both men as they moved through patterns they'd practiced 1,000 times. The blade came from nowhere, out of the sun, aimed at the gap between Alaric's shoulder plates where the armor was thinnest. He moved on pure instinct, twisted left, felt the blade score across his ribs instead of punching through his spine, reversed his training sword and drove the pommel into his attacker's face hard enough to shatter bone. The assassin went down, dead before he hit the ground from the angle Alaric's counterstrike had caught his neck. Dorian was already moving, sword out, scanning for more threats, but the training yard had gone silent and still, just one dead man in servant's clothes bleeding out on the packed earth. Here's what you learn after the first assassination attempt. They're never just the first. They're a message, a promise. The opening move in a game where the stakes are your continued existence. Alaric stood over the corpse, breathing hard, blood running hot down his side. The cut wasn't deep, but it burned like fire. "Search him," he said quietly. Dorian crouched, pulled back the dead man's sleeve to reveal a tattoo. 3 interlocking circles, the mark of House Corvin, one of the houses they'd purged after the conspiracy, one of the families that had lost everything. "The survivor came for revenge," Dorian said. Not surprising. "No," Alaric agreed, "but concerning. Because if one survivor had gotten close enough to strike, there would be others. And some of them would be smarter, more patient, better trained. The purge had been necessary, had saved the kingdom from internal collapse, but it had also created a generation of people who wanted him dead and had nothing left to lose. That's the price of brutal efficiency. You solve the immediate problem and create a dozen future ones. Alaric's father had taught him that, had spent his entire reign fighting the ghosts of enemies he'd made decades earlier. Now Alaric was walking the same path. Seraphine found him in his chambers an hour later. The cut had been cleaned and stitched, 12 neat sutures holding skin together. It would scar. Add another line to the collection he'd accumulated over 42 years of violence. She stood in the doorway watching him with those winter eyes. "You're compromised," she said without preamble. "Someone got past your personal guard. That means either your security is failing or someone inside the palace is helping them." "Or both," Alaric said. He pulled on a fresh shirt, wincing as the fabric dragged across the wound. "What do you recommend?" "A purge of the palace staff. Background checks on everyone from cooks to cleaners. Restrict access to your private quarters. Triple the guard rotation." She moved into the room. "And stop training in open yards where anyone with a blade and a death wish can reach you. So hide in my rooms like a coward. So survive like someone who understands the difference between bravery and stupidity." Seraphine's voice was sharp. "You're the kingdom, Your Majesty. If you die, everything we've built collapses. Your pride isn't worth that risk." She was right. He hated it, but she was right. This is what happens when you let someone like Seraphine into your inner circle. She doesn't tell you comforting lies, doesn't massage your ego, just delivers brutal truth and expects you to swallow it. Most kings surrounded themselves with people who told them what they wanted to hear. Alaric had chosen differently. Had picked the woman who'd tell him he was being an idiot when he needed to hear it. Some days that felt like wisdom. Other days it felt like prolonged torture. "Do it," he said. "The security overhaul. All of it." Seraphine nodded and turned to leave. "Wait," Alaric said. She stopped. "The tattoo. 3 interlocking circles. How many survivors are we talking about from the purged houses?" Her face went very still. "Approximately 247. That we know of. Could be more who've gone to ground. And how many of those 247 want me dead?" "All of them," she said simply. "You executed their families, burned their homes, erased their legacies. Revenge isn't a possibility for them. It's a certainty. The only question is when and how. So we're living on borrowed time. We've always been living on borrowed time, Your Majesty. Today you just got a reminder." She left before he could respond. Alaric stood alone in his chambers, feeling the stitches pull with each breath, thinking about 247 people who'd dedicated their lives to killing him, who'd wait years if necessary, Who'd die trying because they had nothing left to live for anyway? The second attempt came that night. Poison in his wine. Caught by the royal taster who convulsed and died within seconds. Foam at the mouth, eyes rolling back. The whole terrible display that reminded everyone in the dining hall exactly how fragile life was. The third attempt was a crossbow bolt fired from a rooftop 3 days later. Missed Alaric by inches. Killed the guard standing behind him instead. They never caught the shooter. The fourth attempt was subtler. A servant who'd been with the palace for 12 years revealed as a sleeper agent, caught trying to weaken the hinges on Alaric's bedchamber door. Would have collapsed the frame during the night, crushed him in his sleep. The interrogation revealed a network. 12 people inside the palace, all connected to purged houses, all waiting for orders from someone they called the architect. The executions were public, efficient, brutal enough to send a message. But the attempts didn't stop. This is what war looks like when it moves from battlefields to shadows, when every meal might be your last, every door might be a trap, every face might be hiding a knife. Alaric had fought conventional enemies his whole life, knew how to counter armies and sieges and open rebellion. But this was different. This was fighting ghosts who looked like loyal servants until the moment they struck, and it was wearing him down, not physically. He could handle the constant vigilance, the broken sleep, the paranoia that came with knowing every person around him might be an assassin. What was harder was the isolation, the slow realization that he couldn't trust anyone, couldn't let his guard down for even a moment, couldn't be human because humans made mistakes, and mistakes got you killed. Seraphine's security measures helped. The palace became a fortress within a fortress. Background checks, constant surveillance, guards watching guards watching guards. But it also became a prison. And Alaric was the prisoner. Captain Dorian found him on the battlements one evening, a month after the first assassination attempt. 17 attempts total now. Some successful enough to kill guards or servants, none successful enough to reach Alaric himself. But the cumulative weight of 17 near-death experiences was taking its toll. "You look like hell," Dorian said bluntly. Alaric laughed. It was a harsh sound. "Thanks for the honesty. Someone needs to say it." Dorian leaned against the wall beside him. "You're running yourself into the ground. No sleep, barely eating, treating everyone like an enemy. This isn't sustainable. What choice do I have? You could leave," Dorian said it quietly. "Abdicate. Disappear. Let someone else wear the crown and the target that comes with it." Alaric looked at his oldest friend, saw genuine concern there, also saw the exhaustion. Dorian had been by his side through every attempt, had thrown himself between Alaric and death more times than either of them wanted to count. "And you do what?" Alaric asked. "Come with me? Watch my back in exile? If you asked." Dorian's jaw tightened. "But I'd rather you stayed and fought, because running isn't who you are." "No, but maybe it should be." Alaric turned back to the city below. All those people depending on him, all those lives that would shatter if he died. What kind of king brings this much chaos? The kind who's trying to fix a broken system. Dorian's voice was firm. The purge was necessary. The conspiracy would have destroyed us. And yes, it created enemies. But those enemies were always there. You just forced them into the open where we can see them, fight them, die to them eventually. Maybe. Or maybe you survive long enough to build something better. Something that doesn't require constant bloodshed to maintain. Alaric wanted to believe that, wanted to think there was an endpoint to this, a moment where the killing stopped and peace became possible. But he'd lived too long, seen too much, knew that power was maintained through force, and the moment you stopped applying that force, someone else took your place. His father had understood that, had ruled with an iron fist until the day he died. And what had it gotten him? A funeral attended by obligation rather than grief. A legacy of fear that his son was still living under. Alaric refused to become that, but he didn't know how to be anything else. The decision to hold a public council came from Seraphine. They were in the war room. Late night, maps spread across every surface, intelligence reports stacked in precarious towers, the accumulated data of a kingdom under siege from within. "You need to make a statement," she said. "Something bold. Something that reminds everyone why you're king and why the kingdom needs you." "Like what? A public execution?" "Already doing those." "No. A reformation. She pointed to a document she'd been working on. New laws, new systems. Take everything we've learned from the conspiracy and the assassination attempts and build something that prevents it from happening again. You're talking about fundamental changes to how the kingdom operates. Yes. That'll make enemies of everyone with power under the current system. Also, yes. Seraphine's smile was sharp as broken glass. But it'll also show that you're not just reacting to threats, that you're building towards something. Give people hope instead of fear. Make them believe the chaos has a purpose. And if they don't believe it, then we're no worse off than we are now. At least this way we're moving forward instead of just surviving day to day. Alaric studied the document. It was comprehensive, brilliant, would strip away centuries of accumulated corruption and replace it with systems designed for accountability and transparency. It would also require him to give up significant power, distribute authority to councils and committees instead of centralizing it in the throne. His father would have burned this document and executed anyone who suggested it, which was exactly why Alaric was considering it. Because maybe the problem wasn't external enemies or internal conspiracies. Maybe the problem was the system itself. A structure built on the assumption that one man could hold absolute power without it corrupting him or the kingdom around him. And maybe the only way to save the kingdom was to admit that assumption was wrong. Do it, he said. Draft the full proposal. We'll present it at a public council in 1 week. Seraphine's eyes widened slightly. That's fast. Fast means less time for opposition to organize. We announce it and implement it before anyone can mount a coordinated resistance. He looked at her directly. Unless you think I'm making a mistake, I think you're gambling everything on a single move, but I also think it's the right gamble. She gathered her documents. I'll have it ready. She left him alone with maps and reports and the weight of a decision that would either transform the kingdom or shatter it completely. The announcement of the public council sent shockwaves through the nobility. Half of them saw it as opportunity. The other half saw it as threat. Both were right. Alaric spent the week before the council meeting with advisors and generals and merchants and common folk, listening to their concerns, understanding what they needed, building a picture of the kingdom beyond the palace walls. What he found was exhausting and depressing and somehow hopeful all at once. People were tired. Tired of war. Tired of conspiracy. Tired of living in fear that their lives would be upended by the ambitions of people they'd never meet. They wanted stability. Wanted to know that their children would grow up in a kingdom that wasn't constantly tearing itself apart. And they were willing to support radical change if it meant achieving that stability. This is what leaders forget when they spend too long isolated in palaces. The people they're ruling aren't abstractions. They're human beings with hopes and fears and a deep desire for things to just be okay. Alaric had lost sight of that, had been so focused on survival and power and defeating enemies that he'd forgotten what he was supposed to be protecting. Seraphine's reforms weren't just political maneuvering. They were answering a need that had been building for generations. The night before the council, Alaric couldn't sleep, kept running through scenarios. What if the nobles revolted? What if the military refused to support the changes? What if he was about to trigger a civil war worse than anything the conspiracy could have caused? He found himself walking the palace halls, past guards who saluted but whose faces he couldn't read, past chambers where people slept or plotted or both. Ended up in the archive room, the place where Seraphine spent most of her time. She was there. Of course she was. Bent over documents, making final revisions to the proposal they'd present tomorrow. Can't sleep? She asked without looking up. Terrified I'm about to destroy everything, Alaric admitted. Seemed worth staying awake for. Seraphine set down her pen, looked at him with an expression that might have been sympathy. You know what the difference is between a good king and a great one? She asked. Enlighten me. Good kings maintain the status quo. Keep things stable. Don't rock the boat. She stood, moved to the window. Great kings understand that sometimes the boat needs to capsize completely so you can build a better one. They're willing to risk everything they have for something better. And if I'm wrong, if this destroys us, then at least you tried. At least you reached for something beyond mere survival. That matters more than people realize. Alaric moved to stand beside her. The city sprawled below. Lights burning in windows. People living their lives. Trusting that the king above them knew what he was doing. I'm not sure I deserve that trust, he said quietly. Nobody does. That's what makes leadership terrifying. You're just one person making the best decisions you can with incomplete information and hoping you don't doom everyone who depends on you. Seraphine glanced at him. But you're still making the decisions, still trying. That counts for something. They stood in silence. Two people who'd manipulated and saved and possibly destroyed each other, who couldn't fully trust but had learned to work together anyway. Whatever happens tomorrow, Alaric said, thank you for pushing me toward this, for not letting me hide behind the easy choices. You're welcome, she paused. And Your Majesty? If this works, if we actually pull this off, the kingdom will be stronger than it's been in generations. But it'll also be vulnerable during the transition. The next few months are when enemies will strike. I know. And the assassination attempts will get worse, more coordinated, more desperate. I know that too. Seraphine turned to face him fully. You need to understand something. The people behind these attempts aren't going to stop. They can't. You've taken everything from them. Death is all they have left to give. So what do you recommend? That you stop fighting defensively, stop reacting to their moves. She pulled out a map marked with locations throughout the city. We know where most of the survivors are hiding. We know their networks. We know their safe houses. We could eliminate them. All of them. Permanently. Alaric looked at the map, at the marks indicating targets. Living, breathing people who wanted him dead and probably deserved their rage. You're talking about hunting them down, executing them without trial. I'm talking about cutting out the cancer before it kills the patient. Seraphine's voice was cold. These people will never stop, will never forgive, will teach their children to hate you and their children's children. You can show mercy and die eventually, or you can be ruthless and survive. And what does that make me? A tyrant? A monster? It makes you a king who prioritizes the kingdom over his conscience. She met his eyes. That's the choice. Make peace with it, or don't. But make it consciously. There it was, the fundamental question that had been haunting him since the purge. How much darkness could he embrace before he became the thing he was fighting against? How many lines could he cross before there was nothing left of the man he'd been? His father had crossed every line, had become pure pragmatism without humanity, had saved the kingdom and lost his soul. Alaric had sworn to be different, but different meant vulnerable, meant giving enemies chances to strike, meant choosing principle over security. No, he said finally, we don't hunt them. We defend, we protect, but we don't become executioners. Seraphine's expression didn't change. As you wish, Your Majesty. But Alaric could see the calculation in her eyes, see her filing away his decision for future reference, seeing it as weakness or strength or both. That was the problem with someone like Seraphine. You never knew which side she was really on, only that she was always 3 moves ahead and you were lucky if you could keep up. The public council convened at dawn. The great hall was packed. Every noble house, every guild master, representatives from the military, common folk who'd won spots through lottery. Hundreds of people crammed into a space designed for half that number. The air was thick with sweat and anticipation and barely controlled chaos. Alaric sat on his throne in full regalia, crown, armor, sword at his side, every inch the warrior king who'd built his rule on strength. But what he was about to do required a different kind of strength. Seraphine stood to his right, Captain Dorian to his left. The united front that had held the kingdom together through conspiracy and invasion and assassination. Whether it would hold through this was anyone's guess. Alaric stood. The hall fell silent immediately. That was power, the ability to command attention without saying a word. This kingdom is broken, he began. His voice carried clearly through the space, not from external enemies, not from recent conspiracies, but from centuries of accumulated rot. Systems designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Laws that protect power instead of justice. A structure that makes betrayal inevitable and reform impossible. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alaric let them settle. I've spent the last month fighting assassination attempts. 17 in total. 17 people willing to die just for the chance to kill me. And you know what I realized? They're not wrong to want me dead. Because the system I represent, the structure I've maintained, it's the same one that crushed their families and destroyed their lives. The murmurs grew louder, some angry, some confused, all uncertain where this was going. So today I'm proposing something radical, a complete reformation of how this kingdom operates, distribution of power, accountability systems, protections for those without noble blood or military rank, a kingdom that serves all its people instead of just the ones born into the right families. He gestured and Seraphine stepped forward with the document, started reading the key provisions, each one stripping away traditional noble privileges, each one empowering commoners and merchants and farmers. The reaction was explosive. Half the hall erupted in support, the other half in outrage. Nobles shouting about tradition and birthright. Commoners cheering for change, the noise building until it was deafening. Alaric let it rage for 30 seconds. Then he drew his sword and slammed it against the throne. The metallic clang cut through the chaos like a blade through flesh. Silence fell again. "This isn't a negotiation," Alaric said quietly. "Dangerously. This is happening. The only question is whether you support it or oppose it. And I should be clear about what opposition means." He looked directly at the noble section, at faces red with fury and calculation. "If you choose to resist these reforms, you're choosing civil war. You're choosing to tear this kingdom apart because you'd rather maintain your power than build something better. And if that's your choice, I'll meet you on the battlefield and we'll settle it the old way, with steel and blood and the absolute certainty that only one side walks away. This is what you do when you're gambling everything. You don't leave room for middle ground. Don't give people the option to resist without consequences. You make the choice binary and brutal and hope they choose the option that doesn't end with everyone dead." Lord Brennan stood, the elderly noble who'd questioned the conspiracy evidence. His voice shook but held steady. "Your Majesty, these reforms would fundamentally alter the balance of power that's maintained stability for centuries. You're asking us to give up rights granted by blood and tradition. I'm asking you to give up privileges that have allowed corruption to flourish," Alaric corrected. "And I'm not asking. I'm telling you this is the price of continued peace. You can pay it willingly or you can pay it in blood. Your choice." The hall held its breath. Then a merchant stood, then a guildmaster, then a farmer. One by one, the common folk section rose in support, and slowly, grudgingly, some of the nobles stood too, the younger ones mostly, the ones who'd seen the conspiracy and the purge and understood that the old ways were dying whether they wanted them to or not. But not all of them. Maybe a third remained seated, arms crossed, faces set in stubborn refusal. Alaric counted them silently. 37 nobles refusing to stand. 37 potential rebellions waiting to happen. The same number as the original conspiracy. History repeating itself with different faces, but the same fundamental conflict. "Those of you still seated," Alaric said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "you have 1 week to reconsider. After that, your refusal will be considered active rebellion and treated accordingly. Is that clear?" One of the seated nobles, Lord Varon, young and arrogant, stood abruptly. "And if we choose to leave your kingdom entirely, take our houses and our people, and establish somewhere else? Then you're free to go," Alaric said it calmly. "But you leave with nothing. No land, no titles, no wealth. Everything you have came from this kingdom and stays with this kingdom. You want to start over somewhere else? Do it with what you can carry." Varon's face went white, then red. He opened his mouth to respond, but Lord Brennan cut him off. "We'll need time to consider, to consult our houses, to understand the full implications." "You have 1 week," Alaric repeated. "Use it wisely." The council ended in controlled chaos, people filing out in clusters, whispering, plotting, planning. Seraphine materialized at Alaric's side as the hall cleared. 37, she said quietly. Same number as before. "I noticed. They'll try something. Coordinate. Either mass exodus or coordinated rebellion." She was already thinking through scenarios. "We need to be ready for both. Let them try." Alaric felt the exhaustion hitting him now, the weight of what he'd just done settling into his bones. "I'm done playing defensive. If they want war, we'll give them war. And if they want peace, then we build the kingdom we should have built generations ago." Captain Dorian approached from the other side. His face was grim. "The military is split. Half support the reforms. Half think you've lost your mind. We're looking at potential internal conflict. Then we need to know which generals are with us and which aren't." Alaric turned to Seraphine. "Can you handle that?" "Already working on it." She left without another word. Always moving. Always planning. Dorian watched her go with open distrust. You're giving her too much power, too much access. I know. And you're okay with that? No. Alaric moved toward his private chambers. But I'm choosing to trust her anyway. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is staying alive. Maybe. Or maybe the alternative is becoming so paranoid I can't function, can't lead, can't be anything except a scared animal hiding in a palace. He looked at his oldest friend. I need you to trust my judgment, even when you disagree with it. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll follow you anywhere, Your Majesty. You know that. But I'll also keep telling you when I think you're wrong. Good. Alaric managed a tired smile. That's what I need from you. They parted at the chamber entrance, Dorian returning to the barracks, Alaric entering his rooms alone. The space felt empty, hollow. Even with guards posted outside and Seraphine's security measures in place. He removed the crown, set it on its stand, removed the armor piece by piece until he was just a man, scarred and exhausted and carrying the weight of impossible choices. Sleep didn't come. Just restless half-consciousness filled with scenarios and calculations and the growing certainty that he'd just triggered something that would either save the kingdom or destroy it. No middle ground, no safe outcome, just the precipice and the jump and the terrible knowledge that he wouldn't know if he'd made the right choice until it was far too late to change course. The attack came 5 days later. Not assassination, full military assault. The 37 nobles had coordinated after all, combined their private armies. 12,000 men total, marching on the capital under banners of the old kingdom, the kingdom before reforms, before change, before Alaric had tried to drag them into something better. They called it a liberation, a return to proper order. Alaric called it treason. The capital's defenses went to full alert. Walls manned, gates sealed, civilians evacuated to inner districts. And in the war room, Alaric and Seraphine and Dorian stood over maps showing an army approaching from 3 directions simultaneously. Coordinated, professional, well-planned. They've been preparing this for months, Seraphine said, since before the reforms were announced. They knew this was coming and positioned accordingly. How? Alaric demanded. We've had intelligence on all of them. How did we miss this? Because someone told them how to hide from our intelligence. Someone gave them our surveillance patterns, showed them the blind spots. Alaric's blood ran cold. You think we have another traitor? I think we've always had traitors. We just keep finding new ones. Seraphine's voice was bitter. The question is whether we can win despite them. Dorian slammed his fist on the table. We're outnumbered, underprepared. Our own military is divided. This is a losing battle. Then we don't fight it their way. Alaric's mind was racing. Seraphine, your psychological warfare, can it work on this scale? Depends on the scale. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we make them believe we're stronger than we are, make them doubt their allies, turn them against each other before they even reach our walls. She smiled. That might actually work. The next 48 hours were a blur of forged communications and false intelligence and manipulation on a scale that would have been impressive if it wasn't so desperate. Seraphine's network spread rumors that certain noble houses were planning to betray the others, that the real goal was to seize the throne for themselves, that loyalties had been bought and sold and nobody could trust anyone. Within a day, the rebel army started fragmenting. Arguments broke out between commanders. 3 houses pulled their forces back entirely, refusing to advance until guarantees were made. The attack that should have been overwhelming became fractured and uncertain. But it was still coming, and Alaric had 8,000 men to face 9,000 now. Better odds than before, but still terrible. The battle would happen at the northern approach, where the terrain funneled attackers into killing fields, where Alaric had fought a dozen engagements and knew every rock and rise, where he'd either save his kingdom or watch it burn. He stood on the walls the night before the battle, looking out at cook fires in the distance. Thousands of men preparing to kill and die over the question of whether the kingdom could change or had to stay frozen in tradition. Seraphine joined him silently. Regret the reforms? She asked. No, but I regret the cost. All the people about to die because I wanted something better. They were always going to die. This or the next crisis or the one after that. At least this way their deaths mean something. Do they? Or are we just killing people to prove a point? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. That's the question every leader has to answer. And there's no good answer, just the choice you make and the weight you carry afterward. Down below, in the camps of his own army, men were sharpening weapons and writing letters they hoped wouldn't need to be delivered, making peace with mortality, choosing to fight for something bigger than themselves. Alaric had led men into battle before, but this felt different, more personal. These weren't external enemies invading. These were his own people, divided by vision, willing to kill each other over the shape of their future. It made him sick and furious and desperately sad all at once. "Tomorrow we end this," he said. "One way or another. Either the reforms stand or I die defending them." "Then make sure the reforms stand," Seraphine said, "because I didn't manipulate a kingdom just to watch you throw it away on a battlefield." She left him alone with the stars and the distant fires and the weight of everything about to happen. Alaric thought about his father, about the legacy of fear and strength that had built this kingdom, about whether he was honoring that legacy or destroying it. Thought about the crown sitting in his chambers, the symbol of power that had cost him everything and given him nothing except responsibility and isolation. Thought about Seraphine, the woman who'd saved him or doomed him or both, who he still couldn't fully trust but had chosen to believe in anyway. And he thought about the men sleeping below, willing to die for his vision of a better kingdom, trusting that their king knew what he was doing even when that king was terrified he was leading them all to destruction. The pre-dawn light was just starting to touch the horizon when the horn sounded. The rebel army was advancing. Alaric strapped on his armor, each piece a familiar weight, each buckle a ritual he'd performed 1,000 times. The sword at his side had killed more men than he wanted to count. He walked through the ranks of his army, looked into faces young and old, saw fear and determination and faith all mixed together. "Today we fight for the future," he told them. "Not the past, not tradition, not the comfort of things staying the same. We fight for the possibility that this kingdom can be better, that your children can grow up in a world less brutal than the one you inherited. That change is possible even when it's terrifying." They roared, not because the words were pretty, but because they needed to believe in something bigger than the violence about to unfold. Alaric took his position at the front line. Dorian on one side. Seraphine had wanted to stay back, but he'd refused. If this was the end, they'd face it together. The rebel army crested the ridge, 9,000 strong despite the defections, banners flying, armor gleaming in the rising sun. At their head rode Lord Varen, young, arrogant, convinced he was saving the kingdom from a mad tyrant. He probably believed it. That was the tragedy. Both sides thought they were right. Both sides thought they were heroes. Only one side could survive. The armies met with a sound like the world breaking, steel on steel, screams, blood, the familiar chaos of battle that Alaric had lived in his entire life. He fought like a man possessed, every strike precise, every movement efficient, killing not for glory, but for survival, for the kingdom, for the future he'd promised. Beside him, Dorian matched him blow for blow, and throughout the line his men held, died, held again. The battle raged for hours, back and forth, neither side gaining clear advantage. Then Seraphine's voice cut through the chaos. "The center's breaking. Fall back to secondary positions." Alaric saw it. The rebel forces punching through their middle line, threatening to split his army in half. "Hold the wings!" he roared. "Cavalry, prepare to flank!" But even as he gave the orders, he knew they were losing. Slowly, inevitably. The numbers were against them. This was it. The moment where everything fell apart, where his gamble failed and his kingdom died and all those reforms meant nothing except a reason for good people to kill each other. Then from the south came the sound of horns. Not rebel horns, not his horns. Different, unfamiliar. And over the southern ridge poured fresh troops, 5,000 strong, armor-bearing marks Alaric had never seen. At their head rode a figure in ceremonial plate, a woman with dark hair and eyes that burned with purpose. She raised her sword and her voice carried across the battlefield. "For the true kingdom, for reform, for the future!" And Alaric realized with shock that was spreading through both armies like wildfire. Seraphine hadn't just been planning defenses and spreading rumors. She'd been recruiting, building alliances, reaching out to minor houses and merchant guilds and military units who'd been waiting for a sign that change was really possible. She'd built a third army, one loyal not to tradition or nobility, but to the idea that the kingdom could be better. And she'd kept it secret even from him. The rebel forces wavered, caught between Alaric's defenders and this new force, their advantage evaporating. Lord Varen tried to rally them, tried to turn the tide, but the momentum had shifted. His men were breaking, running. The battle was over. Alaric stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the dead and dying, victory tasting like ash and blood. Seraphine rode up, dismounted, walked toward him calmly through the carnage. "Surprise," she said, and Alaric didn't know whether to kiss her or kill her, because she'd saved them, undeniably, brilliantly. But she'd also built an army in secret, hidden it from her king, demonstrated power that rivaled or exceeded his own. The woman who might be his salvation or his doom had just proven she was always 3 moves ahead. And the terrifying part? He still didn't know which side she was really on, only that the kingdom had survived, and the game was far from over. The silence after battle is worse than the battle itself. Alaric stood in the center of what had been a killing field an hour ago. Now it was just mud and blood and bodies, thousands of them, men who'd woken up this morning believing in something enough to die for it. Half had believed in tradition, the other half in change. All of them were equally dead now. The smoke from burning equipment drifted across the landscape like funeral shrouds. The smell was copper and char and human waste. The smell of every battlefield Alaric had ever walked. The smell that never left you no matter how many times you bathed or how far you ran from it. His armor was covered in gore. Some of it his. Most of it belonging to men whose names he'd never know. Men who'd died because he'd decided the kingdom needed to transform, and they'd decided it needed to stay the same. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after you've survived something you shouldn't have. When the adrenaline bleeds away and leaves behind nothing but the weight of what you've done. Every kill replaying in your mind, every face frozen in that final moment of understanding that this was the end. Alaric had felt it before, but never like this. Never with the knowledge that these were his own people, his responsibility, his failure. Seraphine approached through the carnage. Her armor was surprisingly clean. She'd commanded from the ridge, coordinated the cavalry charges, directed the secret army she'd somehow assembled without anyone noticing, including him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to run if he decided killing her was the appropriate response to her deception. "We need to talk," she said. Alaric looked at her. This woman who'd saved his kingdom 3 times now, or destroyed it, he still couldn't tell which. "You built an army," he said quietly. 5,000 men. Trained them. Armed them. Kept it secret from your king. That's treason by any definition. Yes. No denial, no justification, just acknowledgement of the crime. "Why?" Alaric asked. "Why hide it? Why not tell me you were building support for the reforms? Because you would have stopped me." Seraphine's voice was calm. "You would have seen it as a threat, as me consolidating power independent of the throne. You would have been right to see it that way. So I kept it secret until the moment it was needed. And if it hadn't been needed, if the rebels had surrendered or the battle had gone differently, then you never would have known. I would have disbanded them quietly, and you'd have been none the wiser." The honesty of it was like a knife between the ribs. She wasn't even trying to pretend this was anything other than exactly what it looked like. A contingency plan, a backup source of power, insurance against the king she supposedly served. Captain Dorian limped over. He'd taken a sword thrust to the leg during the fighting, refused to leave the field until the battle was won. Now he was bleeding and furious and barely keeping himself upright. "She needs to be executed," he said flatly. "Arrested, tried, executed, today." Seraphine didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Alaric. "That's your right, Your Majesty. I won't resist, won't fight, won't run. If you believe executing me serves the kingdom better than keeping me alive, then do it." She meant it. Again. This woman who'd proven herself the most dangerous person in the kingdom was offering her life without hesitation. And Alaric realized something that made him want to laugh and scream simultaneously. She kept doing this, kept backing him into corners where the obvious choice was the wrong one, where killing her made tactical sense but strategic stupidity, because without her network, her intelligence, her brutal efficiency, the kingdom would have fallen 6 different ways by now. And if he executed her for saving them, what message did that send? That loyalty meant nothing? That competence was punished? But if he didn't execute her, what message did that send? That you could build private armies and deceive your king and face no consequences as long as the results were good? There was no right answer. Just choices that would haunt him either way. This is what power costs at the highest levels. Not the battles or the politics or even the constant threat of assassination. It's the moments like this, where every option is terrible and you have to choose anyway. Where you make decisions that will define your entire reign and you'll never know if you chose correctly. "You're dismissed," Alaric said to Dorian. "Get that leg treated. Your Majesty, you can't seriously—" "That's an order, Captain." Dorian's jaw worked silently. Then he saluted sharply and limped away, every line of his body radiating disapproval. Alaric waited until he was out of earshot, then turned back to Seraphine. "That army of yours, who do they answer to, right now? You. As of the moment the battle ended, I transferred command completely. They're yours to do with as you see fit. And before the battle? Before the battle, they answered to the idea of reform, to the possibility that the kingdom could be better. I recruited people who believed in what you were trying to build." She paused. "I didn't create a personal army loyal to me. I created one loyal to your vision. Words. Just words." She could be lying, could have planted loyalists who'd follow her even under nominal royal command. Or she could be telling the truth. Could have genuinely built support for him and kept it secret because she knew he'd see it as threat rather than gift. The terrible part was, he'd never know which. Would spend the rest of his life wondering if the woman beside him was his greatest ally or his most patient enemy. "You're confined to the palace," he said finally, "under guard, until I decide what to do with you. Understood? And you'll give me complete access to your networks. Every agent, every safe house, every piece of intelligence you've gathered. No secrets, no holdbacks." "Of course." She said it too easily. Like she'd been expecting this. Like she'd already decided what she'd reveal and what she'd keep hidden. Alaric wanted to scream, wanted to shake her until the truth fell out, wanted certainty in a world that seemed designed to deny him any. But he was a king. Kings didn't scream, didn't shake people, didn't show the cracks in their armor no matter how deep they ran. So he just nodded, gestured to the guards who'd been standing at a respectful distance. "Escort Lady Drax to her quarters. She's not to leave without my explicit permission." They moved to comply. Seraphine went with them without resistance, calm as if she was going to dinner instead of effective imprisonment. She stopped at the edge of the battlefield, looked back. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I am on your side. I know you don't believe that. Maybe you never will. But it's true." Then she was gone, surrounded by guards, disappearing into the palace like a ghost, and Alaric was left standing in a field of corpses, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or avoided it by the thinnest margin. The aftermath of civil war is measured in funerals and negotiations, and the slow process of trying to stitch a kingdom back together. The rebel nobles who'd survived surrendered within days. Without leadership and facing a combined force that outnumbered them, they had no choice. Terms were harsh, but not brutal. Loss of titles, heavy fines, exile for the worst offenders. Lord Varen was tried and executed, not for rebellion. Alaric could have shown mercy for that, but for the massacre he'd ordered of a village that had supported the reforms. Civilian casualties. Women and children. The kind of crime that couldn't be forgiven or overlooked. He died badly. Screaming about injustice and tyranny, claiming history would vindicate him. Maybe it would. History had a way of making heroes out of monsters and monsters out of heroes, depending on who was writing it. The reforms moved forward, slowly, with resistance at every step. But they moved. Councils were established. Power was distributed. Systems of accountability were put in place. The kingdom began the painful process of transforming from an autocracy into something resembling a functional government. It was messy, inefficient, frustrating beyond measure. Arguments that would have been settled with a royal decree now required committees and votes and compromise. Alaric hated every minute of it. But he also saw it working. Saw corruption exposed because multiple people had oversight. Saw better decisions made because different perspectives were forced to work together. Saw a kingdom that was starting to function based on systems rather than the whims of whoever held power. His father would have burned it all down, would have seen it as weakness, as the beginning of the end. Alaric chose to see it as evolution, as the kingdom growing beyond its brutal origins into something that might actually last. Seraphine remained confined to the palace, under guard but comfortable. Alaric visited her once a week, ostensibly to review intelligence reports, actually to try to understand her. It didn't work. Every conversation was a chess match, every answer carefully calibrated. She gave him information that was useful but never enough to fully trust, showed loyalty that was consistent but never provable. After 2 months of this, Alaric finally asked the question that had been eating at him. They were in the archive room, her preferred prison, surrounded by documents and maps and the accumulated knowledge of a kingdom. "Why?" he asked. "Why do any of this? You could have disappeared after your father died, taken your house's money and lived comfortably somewhere far from here. Instead, you infiltrated a conspiracy, orchestrated a coup, built secret armies, put yourself in constant danger. For what?" Seraphine set down the report she'd been reading, looked at him with those winter eyes. "Because someone had to," she said simply. "Because the kingdom was rotting and nobody with power cared enough to stop it. Because I watched my father die for trying to do things the right way and realized the right way doesn't work when the system is fundamentally broken. That's not an answer. That's ideology." "Is there a difference?" She stood, moved to the window. "My father believed in honor, in following rules, in trusting that justice would prevail if you just had faith in the process. And they killed him for it, covered it up, moved on like he never existed." Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. Something that might have been grief or rage or both so tightly controlled it couldn't escape. "So I learned a different lesson," she continued, "that if you want to change a broken system, you have to be willing to break every rule the system uses to protect itself. You have to be smarter, more ruthless, more committed than everyone trying to stop you. And that justifies lying to me? Building power behind my back? No, nothing justifies that. But I did it anyway because the alternative was watching the kingdom collapse." She turned to face him. "You want to know why I'm really here? Why I've done all this?" "Yes. Because I believe in what you're trying to build. Not you personally, though you've grown on me, but the vision. A kingdom that functions based on merit and justice instead of blood and violence. That's worth any price. Worth my life, worth yours if necessary." The honesty of it was brutal. She wasn't pledging loyalty to him. She was pledging loyalty to an idea that happened to align with his goals. The distinction mattered more than most people would understand, because personal loyalty could be bought or broken. But commitment to principle? That was harder to corrupt, harder to turn. "If you ever have to choose," Alaric said quietly, "between me and that vision, between my life and the kingdom, which do you pick?" Seraphine didn't hesitate. "The kingdom. Every time." He should have been angry, should have seen it as betrayal or at least disloyalty. Instead, he felt something that might have been respect, because she was right. The kingdom was bigger than any one person, including him, and a ruler who couldn't see that wasn't worthy of ruling. "I'm going to release you," he said. Her eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise he'd ever seen from her. "Why?" "Because keeping you locked up is wasting a resource the kingdom needs. Your intelligence network, your strategic mind, your complete lack of sentimentality when hard choices need to be made." He moved closer. "But understand this. You answer directly to me. No secrets, no private armies, no plans I don't know about. Complete transparency or I'll execute you myself and deal with the consequences." "Agreed," Seraphine said. "I mean it. One more deception, one more game, one more time I find out you've been manipulating things behind my back and we're done. I don't care how valuable you are. I understand. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. I'm not your father. I won't trust the process to deliver justice. If you betray me, I won't file complaints or follow procedure. I'll put a blade through your heart myself and sleep fine that night. Are we clear?" Crystal. They stood there in the archive room, king and strategist, ruler and weapon, trying to figure out if they could actually trust each other or if this was just another layer of mutual manipulation. Alaric decided he didn't care anymore. decided that some questions didn't have answers and you just had to move forward anyway. You start tomorrow, he said. Full access restored, but you report to me daily. Every piece of intelligence, every decision, everything. Yes, Your Majesty. She left quickly, like she was afraid he'd change his mind, and Alaric stood alone wondering if he'd just made the smartest decision of his reign or signed his own death warrant. The kingdom found its rhythm over the next year. The reforms bedded in. People adjusted. The initial chaos gave way to something resembling order. Not perfect, never perfect, but functional. Trade increased as merchants felt safer investing in a kingdom with stable laws. Population grew as people emigrated from less stable regions. The military rebuilt under new commanders who'd proven themselves in the Civil War. And through it all, Seraphine worked, building intelligence networks that actually reported to the crown, identifying corruption before it metastasized, solving problems before they became crises. She was brilliant, terrifying, indispensable, and Alaric still didn't fully trust her. But he learned to work with that uncertainty, learned that you could function effectively with someone even when you weren't sure of their ultimate loyalty. It required constant vigilance, required accepting that he'd never have complete certainty, but it also meant he had someone who could see patterns he missed, who could make the calls he was too principled to make, who could be the darkness necessary to protect the light he was trying to build. They developed a rhythm, a partnership built on mutual respect and mutual wariness, neither fully trusting, both absolutely committed to keeping the kingdom functioning. It wasn't friendship, wasn't love, wasn't even traditional loyalty. It was something stranger, more honest. Two people who saw each other clearly, flaws and brilliance and danger all mixed together, and chose to work together anyway. Captain Dorian never trusted her, made that clear at every opportunity. But he also couldn't deny the results. The kingdom was stronger with her than without her. That was undeniable. The assassination attempts slowed, then stopped. Partly because security was better, mostly because the survivors of the purged houses realized they couldn't win, that Alaric had consolidated power too thoroughly, that revenge wasn't worth the certainty of death. Some of them even accepted positions in the new government, used their skills in service of the kingdom rather than its destruction. It was pragmatism rather than forgiveness. But Alaric would take pragmatism. Forgiveness was overrated anyway. What mattered was functionality, people working together toward common goals even when they hated each other. That was the real secret of governing, not inspiring love or loyalty or devotion, just convincing people that cooperation served their interests better than conflict. His father had ruled through fear, kept people in line through the constant threat of violence. Alaric was building something different, rule through systems, through laws that applied to everyone, including him, through the grinding reality that working together produced better outcomes than tearing each other apart. It was exhausting, required constant attention, constant adjustment. But it was also working. The second anniversary of the reforms arrived without ceremony or celebration. Just another day of work, another series of decisions, another step forward in the endless process of trying to build something better. Alaric was in his study reviewing agricultural reports when Seraphine knocked. "Come in," he called. She entered carrying a leather satchel, set it on his desk with a heavy thud. "What's this?" he asked. "Everything." Her voice was quiet. "Every agent I have, every safe house, every piece of intelligence I've gathered over the last 3 years, every secret I've kept from you." Alaric stared at the satchel, then at her. "Why now?" "Because you need to know you can trust me. Because I'm tired of operating in shadows. Because the kingdom is stable enough now that you don't need me to be the monster behind the throne anymore." She met his eyes. "Or you still do, and I'm making a massive mistake. But either way, you deserve complete honesty." He opened the satchel. Inside were documents, hundreds of them, names, locations, operations he'd never known about, including several that would have been considered treasonous if he'd known about them when they were happening. "You infiltrated 3 foreign courts," he said, reading. "Compromised 2 generals in the Eastern Alliance. Poisoned a merchant prince who was funding rebellion." "All true," Seraphine confirmed. "All things I judged necessary for the kingdom's survival. All things I kept from you because you would have stopped me." Alaric kept reading. Each revelation worse than the last. Assassinations, blackmail, manipulation on a scale that would make most spy masters weep with envy. You've committed enough treason here to justify execution 10 times over, he said. Yes, and you're just handing it to me. Yes. Why? Because I'm done lying. Because we've built something worth protecting, and that means operating in the light instead of darkness. Because you deserve to know exactly who you're working with and decide consciously whether to keep me or kill me. She said it calmly. Like offering him the choice between her life and death was no different than asking what he wanted for dinner. And that right there was why she was so dangerous. She'd weaponized honesty, made herself so valuable that even knowing all her crimes, Alaric would have to be insane to execute her. Or would he? He could burn these documents, execute Seraphine, claim she'd been operating as a rogue agent, consolidate everything under direct royal control. It would be the safe choice, the traditional choice, the thing his father would have done without hesitation. But it would also mean losing the most capable intelligence operative the kingdom had ever seen. Losing the woman who'd saved his life and his throne more times than he could count. Losing someone who understood the darkness necessary to protect the light. How many people know about this? He asked, gesturing to the satchel. Just me. Every operation was compartmentalized. Agents didn't know what they were part of, just executed specific tasks. So I could make this disappear and nobody would know. Yes. And you? Would you continue operating this way if I asked? No. Seraphine's voice was firm. I'm done with secrets. Going forward, everything I do is with your knowledge and approval, or I don't do it at all. Even if that means letting threats develop that you could stop? Even then. Because the kingdom doesn't need me to be its conscience anymore. It has systems. It has laws. It has checks on power. What it needs now is for everyone, including me, to operate within those systems instead of around them. Alaric read through more documents, each one a revelation, each one proof of crimes that should demand execution, and each one also proof that Seraphine had been protecting the kingdom with a ruthlessness that bordered on devotion. I should kill you for this, he said quietly. I know, but I'm not going to. Why not? Because you're right. The kingdom needed this, needed someone willing to do the things I couldn't do publicly, needed the monster behind the throne. He closed the satchel, but you're also right that we don't need that anymore. We've built something better, something that can function without shadows. So what happens to me? You become what you should have been from the start. My official spy master, operating with full authority and full transparency. No secrets, no independent operations, just intelligence gathering and analysis under Crown authority. And if I refuse, then I execute you and find someone else. But I don't think you'll refuse. Because you meant what you said about believing in this kingdom. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then she knelt. Actually knelt. This woman who'd never shown deference to anyone. I swear on everything I am, she said, voice steady. I will serve this kingdom and its king with complete loyalty and honesty for the rest of my life. No secrets, no games, no manipulation. You have my word. Alaric looked down at her. This dangerous, brilliant, terrifying woman who'd saved him or destroyed him or both, depending on how you measured. And he realized something that changed everything. He trusted her, not because she'd proven herself loyal, not because he'd eliminated all doubt, but because he'd chosen to trust despite the doubt. Chosen to believe that someone could be both dangerous and devoted, both manipulative and genuine. That was the final lesson. The one that had taken him years to learn. Trust wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing to believe in someone even when you knew they could betray you, making yourself vulnerable because the alternative was isolation and paranoia and the slow death of your humanity. His father had never learned that, had died alone because he couldn't risk trusting anyone. Alaric refused to make the same mistake. Rise, he said. You don't kneel to me. We're partners, equals in everything except title. Seraphine stood, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw tears in her eyes. Just a hint, just enough to prove she was human underneath all the calculation. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. Being official means official accountability. You answer to the council now. Your operations are subject to oversight. Everything transparent. I understand. And Seraphine? One more thing, yes? Welcome home. The words hung between them, an acknowledgement that she'd been in exile, self-imposed or otherwise, and was finally being allowed to belong. She smiled. It was genuine and soft and beautiful. "Thank you, Your Majesty, for giving me something worth fighting for." The years that followed were the most stable the kingdom had seen in generations. The reforms worked, not perfectly, never perfectly, but they worked. The kingdom grew, prospered, became a place people wanted to live instead of escape from. Alaric ruled with a combination of strength and restraint his father would have found incomprehensible. Shared power, trusted systems, admitted when he was wrong and corrected course. And beside him, Seraphine built an intelligence network that operated in the open, reporting to councils, subject to oversight, using its considerable power to protect rather than manipulate. They never became lovers, never even became friends in the traditional sense, but they became something rarer, partners who understood each other completely, who could work together despite fundamental differences, who'd learned that you didn't need to trust someone perfectly to trust them enough. Captain Dorian eventually accepted Seraphine's presence. Never liked her, never would, but he respected what she brought to the kingdom. That was enough. The assassination attempts became history. The survivors of the Purge either integrated into the new kingdom or faded into obscurity. The wounds of civil war healed slowly, but they healed. And through it all, Alaric learned what it meant to be a different kind of king. Not the conqueror his grandfather had been, not the tyrant his father had been. Something new, something that balanced strength with wisdom, power with restraint. The ability to rule with the understanding that he was temporary, but the kingdom was meant to last forever. On the 5th anniversary of the reforms, he stood on the palace battlements, same place he'd stood so many times before, looking out over the city. It was different now, cleaner, more prosperous. The sounds rising up weren't screams or fighting, but commerce and life, and the normal chaos of people living without constant fear. Seraphine joined him silently. They stood together watching the sun set over the kingdom they'd built together through blood and manipulation and the slow process of learning to trust. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked. "The kingdom? Maybe. Maybe not. Nothing lasts forever." Alaric turned to her. "But we've given it the best chance we could. Built something based on systems instead of personalities. That's more than most rulers manage. Do you regret any of it? The Purge? The Civil War? Trusting me?" "Every day." He said it honestly. "Every decision I made cost lives, caused suffering, created enemies. I'll carry that weight until I die." "But you'd do it again." It wasn't a question. "Yes," he confirmed. "Because the alternative was worse. Because sometimes the only way forward is through darkness and blood and impossible choices. Because someone has to be willing to pay that price, or nothing ever changes." They stood in comfortable silence. Two people who'd started as enemies or allies or both. Who'd learned to work together despite every reason not to. Who'd built something that might actually outlast them. That's the real measure of leadership. Not the battles you win or the enemies you defeat, but whether you leave things better than you found them. Whether you build something that continues after you're gone. Alaric had done that. At terrible cost, with compromises that still kept him awake some nights. But he'd done it. The kingdom would survive, would grow, would become something his father wouldn't recognize and his grandfather would probably hate. And that was exactly what it needed to be. Captain Dorian approached from behind. His limp was barely noticeable now. The wound from the Civil War had healed as well as it was going to. "Your Majesty, council meeting in an hour. They're debating the Merchant Guild proposals again." Alaric sighed. "Let me guess. Nobody can agree on anything and they want me to break the tie. Actually, they worked it out themselves. Just wanted you informed." He stopped, turned. "They resolved it? Without me?" "Appears so." Dorian's expression was carefully neutral. "Seems the system is working." And there it was. The proof that what they'd built was real. That the kingdom could function based on process and cooperation instead of royal decree. It should have felt like loss of power, should have threatened his authority. Instead, it felt like victory. "Good," Alaric said. "That's how it should work." He left the battlements, headed inside to a council meeting where he'd be one voice among many instead of the only voice that mattered. Where decisions would be made through argument and compromise instead of command. His father was probably spinning in his grave. Alaric chose to see that as progress. That night, alone in his chambers, he removed the crown, set it on its stand, looked at it in the candlelight. This thing had cost him everything: his youth, his certainty, any chance at a normal life, had turned him into someone who made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. But it had also given him purpose, had forced him to become better than he would have been, had taught him that true strength wasn't domination, but the ability to share power, to trust despite doubt, to build something bigger than himself. He thought about Seraphine, about the woman who'd saved him or destroyed him or both, who'd become the partner he'd never known he needed, who taught him that trust wasn't about certainty, but about choosing to believe anyway. He thought about Dorian, about loyalty that survived disagreement, about friendship that could weather doubt and still remain solid. He thought about the kingdom, about all the people living their lives below, trusting that the system would protect them, that justice would prevail, that tomorrow would be better than today. And he thought about his father, about the legacy of fear and strength that had built this kingdom and almost destroyed it, about whether he'd honored that legacy or betrayed it, decided he'd done both, kept the strength, discarded the fear, built something new from the ashes of the old. That was enough, had to be enough. Because the alternative was spending his life wondering if he'd made the right choices instead of making peace with the choices he'd made. Alaric Voss had been called many things: warrior, tyrant, reformer, fool, king. But here, in the quiet of his chambers with no one watching, he could admit what he really was: human, flawed, trying his best in impossible circumstances, making mistakes and learning from them, building something imperfect but better than what came before. That was the true secret of power. Not that you knew what you were doing, but that you kept going anyway, kept making decisions despite the doubt, kept building despite the uncertainty, kept choosing to trust and believe and hope, even when every instinct screamed caution. His father had ruled through fear because he'd been afraid of weakness, afraid of betrayal, afraid of the uncertainty that came with trusting anyone. Alaric had learned a different lesson: that fear was the enemy, that the only way to truly lead was to make yourself vulnerable, to share power, to trust imperfectly, to accept that you'd never have certainty and move forward anyway. And in that acceptance, that fundamental willingness to be uncertain and act anyway, lay the difference between surviving and actually living. The kingdom was in good hands now, better than his alone. It had systems and laws and people who believed in something bigger than themselves. It would outlast him, would grow beyond him, would become something he couldn't imagine. And that was exactly as it should be, because kingdoms weren't meant to be one person's vision imposed on everyone else. They were meant to be collective dreams, shared struggles, the accumulated effort of millions of people trying to build something better. All a king could do was guide that effort, protect that dream, make the hard choices so others didn't have to, pay the cost so others could live free. Alaric had done that, would continue doing it as long as he wore the crown. And when his time came, when age or assassination or simple exhaustion finally caught up with him, the kingdom would continue. That was his legacy. Not the battles won or enemies defeated, but the understanding that he was temporary and the kingdom was forever. And in that understanding lay something approaching peace. He picked up the crown one more time, felt its weight, its history, its promise. Tomorrow there would be more decisions, more impossible choices, more compromises between principle and pragmatism. But tonight he could rest, could let go of the constant vigilance and just be. A man who'd tried his best, a king who'd built something worth protecting, a human being who'd learned that strength wasn't about domination, but about the courage to be vulnerable. That was enough. Had to be enough. And in the quiet darkness of his chambers, Alaric Voss, warrior, reformer, king, finally allowed himself to believe it was. The kingdom slept, and so did its king, not without doubt, not without fear, but with the hard-won knowledge that he'd done what he could with what he had. And sometimes, in this broken world, that was the only victory that mattered. The end came not with drama, but with simple passage of time. The kingdom continued, grew stronger, became the thing Alaric had dreamed it could be. And when his time finally ended, decades later, surrounded by people who respected, if not loved him, his final thought was simple: it was worth it. Every sacrifice, every impossible choice, every sleepless night and terrible decision, worth it, because the kingdom survived. And in its survival lay the proof that change was possible, that broken systems could be reformed, that even the darkest moments could give way to something better. That was the real story. Not the battles or the betrayals or the constant struggle for survival, but the understanding that humans, flawed, uncertain, terrified humans, could still build something beautiful when they chose to trust each other despite every reason not to. That lesson lived on long after Alaric Voss was dust, and in that continuation lay immortality of a kind, not in monuments or history books, but in the lives of people who lived free because someone had been willing to pay the price for their freedom. That was power. That was legacy. That was enough.